Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crime Stories for Sleep. I'm Robert, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they are essential to help the channel grow and allow me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let us dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. In the unassuming red brick heart of Hyde, a working-class town on the outskirts of Manchester, Dr. Harold Shipman wasn't just a general practitioner. He was a pillar for the elderly residents of this former textile manufacturing town. Dr. Shipman represented an image of calm authority and deep comfort. In an era when the National Health Service was stretched thin and doctors tended to be rushed and impersonal, Fred, as he preferred to be called, seemed like a throwback to a gentler time. He was the kind of doctor who still made house calls, who would sit in his patients' tidy, memento-filled living rooms with a cup of tea, and attend not just to their physical ailments, but to the quiet worries of their lives. He was a fixture of the community, a man of solid, reassuring appearance with his neatly trimmed beard and his calm, almost avuncular manner. He radiated a sense of unwavering competence. The patients of his solo practice on Market Street adored him. They saw him as a protector, a benevolent guardian who shielded them from the hardships of aging. He was the person they trusted in their most vulnerable moments, with their fears, and ultimately, with their very lives. They welcomed him into their homes. These independent women who'd survived wars and economic depressions would offer their arms for his blood pressure cuff, their chests for his stethoscope, their innermost concerns for his counsel. They had faith in him. They believed he was there to ease their suffering, to extend their lives, to provide a dignified and peaceful end when the time came. But beneath this mask of compassionate care, Harold Shipman was engaged in a secret, horrific act of betrayal. He was no healer. He was a predator, and his hunting ground was the very community that had given him its absolute trust. For years, in the private sanctuary of his patients' homes, Dr. Shipman played God, deciding with the cold, detached precision of an engineer who would live and who would die. He wasn't easing their pain. He was ending their lives. Armed with a syringe filled with a lethal dose of diamorphine, the pharmaceutical-grade heroin he used as his silent weapon, he turned the sacred bond between doctor and patient into an instrument of death. One by one, his unsuspecting patients would die quietly, their deaths recorded simply as the natural, inevitable result of old age. Harold Shipman, the kindly doctor, was always there to sign the death certificates, to console the grieving families, and to carefully alter the medical records, burying his crimes beneath layers of falsified data. He was secretly the most prolific serial killer in modern British history, a man who moved through society cloaked in the unquestionable respectability of a doctor's white coat, his true nature hidden in plain sight. The path that led Harold Shipman to the parlors of Hyde began in the post-war austerity of a Nottingham council estate. Born in 1946 to working-class, deeply Methodist parents, he was an intelligent and hard-working boy. But it was his relationship with his mother, Vera, that would cast the longest shadow over his life. He was her favorite child, her confidant, and he watched with helpless teenage anguish as she slowly succumbed to lung cancer. In the final agonizing stages of her illness, a doctor would come to their home to administer morphine injections, a powerful opiate that would ease her pain and give her moments of peace before her death in 1963, when Harold was just 17. He witnessed firsthand the almost godlike ability of a doctor to provide not just medicine but relief from suffering, a power over life and death itself. It was an observation that seemed to plant itself deep in his psyche. He went on to attend medical school in Leeds, a driven and ambitious young man. It was there that he met his wife, Primrose Oxtoby, and after completing his training in 1970, they began building a family that would eventually include 4 children. His early career, however, was marked by an ominous dark secret. While working as a junior doctor at Pontefract General Infirmary, he developed an addiction to pethidine, another powerful opioid painkiller. He was caught forging prescriptions for his own use, a crime that resulted in a modest fine and a brief stay in a rehabilitation clinic. The General Medical Council, the body regulating the medical profession, gave him a warning, but, in a decision with catastrophic consequences, allowed him to continue practicing medicine. It was an instance of professional leniency and systemic failure that would recur throughout his murderous career. By 1977, he'd relocated to the Donnybrook Medical Center in Hyde, a busy group practice where he quickly gained a reputation as a hard-working and dependable family doctor. But his colleagues noticed his violent mood swings and arrogance, making the partnership untenable. In 1993, he struck out on his own, establishing his solo practice at 21 Market Street. It was here, without partners to scrutinize his behavior or question his decisions, that his killing campaign escalated to an assembly line scale. He answered to no one, a solitary practitioner endowed with authority over life and death, and he began exercising that authority with alarming frequency. The deaths were quiet, unremarkable events. An elderly person, frequently a solitary woman, would be found to have died peacefully in her chair following a visit from the kindly doctor. Shipmen would arrive, declare the death, and comfort the family, explaining that it was simply their loved one's time to go. He attributed it to heart failure, a stroke, or old age. The bereaved families, in shock and grief, saw no reason to question his judgment. He was the medical expert. His word was final, and Shipman had a plausible, soothing explanation for every case. He would then complete the death certificate, a critical step that sealed the matter, preventing the mandatory involvement of a coroner and any possibility of a post-mortem examination. He'd discovered the perfect crime, a murder that perfectly mimicked natural death, carried out by the only person whose presence was not just expected, but required. The first flicker of suspicion, the first hint that something was terribly wrong in Hyde, didn't come from a grieving family member or a suspicious police officer. It came from within the medical community. In March 1998, Dr. Linda Reynolds, another general practitioner from a nearby clinic, became disturbed by a troubling pattern. She'd noticed an unusually high number of her former patients who'd transferred to Shipman's care were now deceased. This was more than just a statistical anomaly. It was a concentration of deaths that defied rational explanation. Her concern was echoed by a local funeral director, who'd also remarked on the excessive frequency of deaths among Shipman's patients, especially older women who seemed to die under similar circumstances. Driven by professional duty and a growing unease she could no longer ignore, Dr. Reynolds decided to act. She brought her concerns to John Pollard, the area's coroner. She was worried not just about the death toll, but about the number of cremation forms Shipman was requesting her to countersign as a second signatory. In Britain, cremation procedures required verification by another doctor as a safeguard against foul play. Shipman seemed to be submitting an unusually high volume of these forms to his colleagues. Reynolds sensed that something was gravely wrong. She feared that a medical practitioner in her own community might be a killer. The coroner, troubled by her account, forwarded the information to Greater Manchester Police. An investigation began, but it was low-key and somewhat tentative, handled by inexperienced officers who may have been intimidated by the prospect of investigating a respected local doctor. They conducted a discreet inquiry, reviewing documents and looking for obvious red flags, but found nothing incriminating. Shipman's records, carefully falsified, stood as an impenetrable fortress of deception. They depicted patients with declining health and conditions that made their sudden deaths believable. The police, lacking adequate evidence for prosecution, determined there were no grounds for legal action. On April 17, 1998, the investigation closed. A catastrophic missed opportunity where the system failed to stop a monster and instead gave him clearance to continue. This verdict would face severe criticism in later public inquiries that faulted law enforcement for insufficient thoroughness and an excessive deference to Shipman's professional status. For Shipman, the terminated investigation likely served as powerful confirmation. He'd undergone police scrutiny and emerged unscathed, seemingly untouchable. Emboldened by this outcome, he went on to claim 3 more lives in the following months. However, whispers of doubt didn't completely fade. John Shaw, a local taxi driver, also began harboring his own serious misgivings after observing a disturbing pattern among his elderly female passengers. He would drive them to appointments with Dr. Shipman. Women who seemed perfectly well, only to later hear they died suddenly. He voiced his concerns to authorities in August, another warning voice in a town still unprepared to hear such warnings. But it wasn't from vigilant doctors or observant drivers that Shipman's downfall would come. Rather stemmed from his own fatal arrogance, his ultimate error in judgment that soon followed. Kathleen Grundy defied stereotypes of frail old age. At 81, she remained vibrant, a former mayor of Hyde, wealthy, energetic, fiercely independent. A woman universally regarded as enjoying excellent health. She was a community pillar, much like her trusted physician, Harold Shipman, in whom she placed absolute faith. On June 24, 1998, Dr. Shipman visited her residence for the final time anyone would see her alive. Later that same day, she was discovered deceased. The cause, according to his certification, was simply old age. Her daughter, Angela Woodruff, an accomplished lawyer, received news of her mother's sudden loss as a devastating blow, soon compounded by a baffling and deeply suspect revelation. Shortly after her mother's passing, Woodruff was contacted by her mother's solicitor, Brian Burgess. He'd received a document, a will, allegedly written by Kathleen Grundy shortly before she died. Its contents were astonishing. The will left Kathleen Grundy's entire substantial estate, worth nearly £400,000 sterling, to a single person, her Dr. Harold Shipman. It specifically disinherited her own daughter and grandchildren, bizarrely stating, "My family are not in need financially, and I want to reward him for all the care he has given to me and the people of Hyde." Angela Woodruff immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. Her mother would never have done such a thing. The will was a crude, poorly typed document, its signature a shaky, unconvincing forgery. It felt like an insult to her mother's memory and a brazen act of theft. Encouraged by Burgess, Woodruff decided not to let this go. She took the will to the police, her professional and daughterly instincts screaming that this was not just about a forged will, but something far more sinister. This time the police listened. The combination of a sudden death and a suspicious will benefiting the attending doctor was too conspicuous to overlook. The investigation that had been so hastily closed just months earlier was reopened, now with a serious and frightening new direction. The fresh investigation, led by a more experienced team of detectives, began with one crucial step. They needed to determine the true cause of Kathleen Grundy's death. Her body was exhumed, a solemn and eerie process that would eventually yield the first piece of solid forensic evidence. The toxicology results came back, and they were definitive. Kathleen Grundy's body contained lethal concentrations of diamorphin, pharmaceutical-grade heroin. She hadn't died of old age. She'd been murdered. This finding transformed the investigation entirely. It was no longer about fraud. It had become a homicide case. And the main suspect was the person who stood to gain from her wealth. On September 7th, 1998, Dr. Harold Shipman, the respected local doctor, was arrested on suspicion of murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Hyde. The community was stunned. How could their beloved physician, their trusted figure, be a killer? It seemed inconceivable, a breach of trust so profound it shook the foundation of their community. Shipman's wife, Primrose, stood by him steadfastly, insisting on his innocence. Shipman himself projected an air of offended denial. When confronted with the diamorphine evidence, he fabricated a story. He claimed that Kathleen Grundy had been a secret drug user and presented his computerized medical notes as proof to police. But the police were now doing their work with an intensity missing from the initial probe. A forensic examination of Shipman's computer uncovered the truth. The records about Grundy's alleged addiction were created after her death. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt to cover his tracks, another display of hubris that only tightened the trap further. Authorities also located the typewriter used to produce the fake will, a brother machine owned by Shipman himself, making the case against him for Kathleen Grundy's murder now overwhelming. But investigators realized with growing dread that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Earlier concerns raised by Dr. Reynolds and funeral directors about numerous deaths all pointed to a pattern. They began examining other deaths certified by Shipman. As they did, a horrifying picture unfolded. They selected 15 sample cases, all elderly women who died suddenly under Shipman's care between 1995 and 1998. One by one, their bodies were exhumed. One by one, toxicology reports delivered the same spine-chilling results: lethal levels of diamorphine. This was no isolated incident. A pattern emerged. A doctor's house call, followed by sudden death, accompanied by falsified medical records. Shipman wasn't just guilty of one murder. He was a serial killer whose crimes appeared increasingly extensive and horrifying. The trial against Dr. Harold Shipman opened on October 5th, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. Public seating overflowed, media benches packed beyond capacity. It had become a national obsession, tapping into primal fears about betrayal from caregivers trusted implicitly. Shipman, aged 53, sat in the defendant's box projecting middle-class respectability, denying all charges leveled against him. 15 counts of murder among female patients, plus forgery concerning Kathleen Grundy's will. The prosecution team meticulously presented overwhelming evidence. Toxicological data confirming diamorphine presence across victim systems. The counterfeit was showing clear financial motive, plus a recurring pattern dubbed the Shipman effect. Statistical spikes coinciding with afternoon house calls, resulting in unexpected deaths, often witnessed directly by the physician himself. The prosecution called a succession of witnesses, among them relatives of the deceased, who shared heartbreaking stories of their mothers and grandmothers. These vibrant women in good health one moment were gone the next. They expressed their shock, their grief, and their absolute unwavering trust in the man now on trial for their murders. Marion Hadfield, a friend of the deceased Marie West, recounted an especially chilling incident. She was in the kitchen while Shipman was with Marie in the living room. She noticed their conversation stop, and shortly after, Shipman emerged, looking flustered, and stated that Marie had suddenly had a stroke while he was outside in his car. The investigation later revealed that he'd administered a fatal injection of heroin to her, a substance that would have stopped her breathing in less than a minute. Shipman's legal team countered, trying to plant doubt in the jurors' minds. They challenged the forensic evidence and questioned the witnesses' motives. They also made an unsuccessful attempt to have the Grundy case tried separately, arguing that the obvious financial motive would prejudice the jury regarding the other 14 charges. But the weight of evidence was crushingly heavy. At the center of it all was Shipman himself, who declined to testify, offering no explanation, no remorse, no defense beyond complete denial. His arrogance, the very trait that had enabled him to kill repeatedly without fear of consequences, became his undoing. He appeared convinced of his intellectual superiority over everyone present, believing he could outwit the police, the prosecutors, and the jury. After a trial spanning nearly 4 months, the jury withdrew to consider their verdict. For 6 days, They wrestled with the evidence and the staggering, almost unbelievable enormity of what they were being asked to accept. On January 31st, 2000, they returned. The foreman stood, his expression grave, and announced the verdict. Guilty on all 15 murder charges. Guilty on the single charge of forgery. A wave of relief and sorrow swept through the courtroom. The victims' families wept tears of pain and vindication. Their long, agonizing quest for justice had reached its end. Shipman remained emotionless throughout. He showed no feeling, his face an expressionless mask. Mr. Justice Forbes didn't hold back in his sentencing remarks. He imposed 15 life sentences to run concurrently with a recommendation that life imprisonment be for life. He would never regain his freedom. "You have finally been brought to justice," the judge declared with resounding condemnation in his voice, "for your wicked crimes." Harold Shipman was led away to begin his permanent incarceration, leaving behind a shocked and horrified nation struggling with the consequences of his appalling betrayal. But this was just the beginning. What had been uncovered during the trial was merely a fraction of a much larger and more sinister reality. The pressing question now wasn't about his guilt, but rather how many people this trusted family physician had sent to their deaths. The subsequent investigation would eventually conclude that Shipman was responsible for the deaths of at least 215 patients, and possibly as many as 250, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history. On January 13th, 24, the day before his 58th birthday, he was found hanging in his cell at Apesham Prison, Wakefield, having taken his own life using a bedsheet. It was a final act of control, a last silent exercise of power. He thereby robbed his victims' families of any chance for a confession or understanding of why he'd destroyed their lives so completely. It was a cowardly escape from accountability, one final selfish act by a man who'd spent years preying on the most vulnerable around him. Harold Shipman's legacy remains complex, yet agonizingly real. He violated every ounce of trust placed in medical practitioners worldwide, shattering the foundational relationship between doctor and patient forever. He left indelible marks upon society's psyche. In Hyde, the community where he once stood revered, a peaceful memorial garden now stands dedicated to commemorating those whose lives were stolen under such horrific circumstances, reclaiming beauty from beneath evil's long shadow. He will always be known not as the Good Doctor, but rather as Dr. Death, whose very name evokes the ultimate betrayal personified. A stark reminder that darkness may lurk behind even the most benign smiles we encounter daily. Story 2. In a modest apartment in Luton, a town north of London, better known for its airport than its tragedies, Juliana Prosper was raising her children. She had left her native Argentina to build a new life in England, and at 48, her world revolved around her kids. Their home on Wallbank Drive was shared with her teenage son Kyle, 16, her daughter Giselle, 13, and her eldest Nicholas, who had just turned 18. To the outside world, they seemed like any ordinary family navigating the daily routines of school, work, and teenage life. Juliana, born Juliana Falcon in the coastal city of Mar del Plata, had filled their home with warmth that softened the gray skies outside. Kyle was a typical teenager, and Giselle, on the cusp of adolescence, brought energy and life to their household. But behind closed doors, and more critically, behind the glowing screens that connected him to a world far beyond Luton, Nicholas was becoming a stranger to everyone who knew him. Born December 18, 2005, he'd been described by childhood friends as a quiet, nerdy kid with a deep interest in technology. He had friends and a social circle, but as he grew older, he withdrew deeper into isolation, moving his interactions from the real world to anonymous forums and the darkest corners of the internet. Though he displayed traits sometimes associated with autism spectrum disorder, it was later confirmed in court that this wasn't the source of the darkness he was carefully cultivating. His isolation wasn't born from sadness. It was intentional. He was building a new identity, one shaped by ideologies of mass violence and notoriety. Nicholas Prosper had become a student of death. He developed an obsessive fascination with school attacks, spending countless hours studying the grim archives of modern tragedies. He fixated particularly on the Sandy Hook Elementary School incident in 2012, when Adam Lanza took 26 lives, including 20 young children. But Nicholas didn't just want to study Lanza. He wanted to surpass him. His goal, secretly nurtured for over a year, was to commit an atrocity so horrific it would etch his name into history. He planned to take 34 lives, a number deliberately chosen to exceed the count from the Virginia Tech incident, one of America's deadliest such events. He wanted his name to become synonymous with a new and even more terrible standard of violence. His plan was chillingly methodical. The target was St. Joseph's Catholic Primary School, his former school. He hadn't been mistreated there. His choice was purely tactical. He knew its layout, its security, its daily routines. He envisioned launching his attack during the 90 AUMN assembly, when students and staff would be gathered together. A crowd of vulnerable targets. And he'd chosen a date, Friday, September 13th, 2024. The selection wasn't random. As he would later admit, he picked it because it had a nice ring to it, an almost theatrical touch that revealed his disturbing detachment from reality. In his detailed blueprint, his own family, the mother who raised him, the siblings who shared his home, were merely collateral. They were the opening act to his main performance. His plan involved ending their lives while they slept, a quick, silent operation requiring 3 shots in under 30 seconds, an elimination he assumed would go unnoticed by neighbors, allowing him to proceed unhindered to his true objective. To realize this vision, he needed a weapon. His first attempt to acquire one, in August 2024, failed. Undeterred, he applied his methodical, obsessive nature to solving this problem. He researched official emblems, the correct paper types, and the signature needed for an authentic UK firearms license. He became a skilled forger. On September 12th, 2024, the eve of his planned massacre, he put his research into practice. He contacted a local firearms dealer and arranged to purchase a double-barreled shotgun and 100 rounds for £650 sterling in cash. The seller, presented with an expertly forged license, believed the transaction was legitimate and even reported it to authorities as protocol required. But the forgery was so flawless that it raised no alarms. Nicholas Prosper, a teenager harboring meticulously planned mass violence in his mind, was now armed. He spent the rest of that day immersed in his sinister preparations. His internet activity from that afternoon painted a disturbing picture of his intentions. He searched for information about arterial structure. Do you die if shot in the neck? And man shoots woman in head at close range? He also made searches related to acts of violence against women and Sarah Everard's murder, another case that had shocked the nation. He wasn't just planning to take lives. He was studying the mechanics of ending them, exploring their most disturbing and invasive possibilities. As the night of September 12th gave way to dawn on Friday the 13th, his chosen day, he continued his digital vigil. He stayed awake watching what was described as violent content until approximately 4:30 a.m. Everything was ready. In the silence before dawn, he conducted a full rehearsal. He fired the shotgun in his bedroom, directing a test shot at a stuffed toy. The muffled blast was a prelude to the terror he intended to unleash. But his careful plans were about to unravel. His mother, Juliana, woke up. This wasn't part of his plan. She emerged from her room to find her eldest son holding a shotgun. The orderly, silent scenario he'd imagined was suddenly replaced by a violent and chaotic struggle for survival. A brutal confrontation erupted in the small apartment. Evidence of Juliana's final desperate fight would later be found on her body. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed she'd tried to protect herself from a knife attack before the shotgun was used. In the end, her maternal courage couldn't overcome her son's cold determination. He fired the shotgun at her head at close range. Her body fell in the hallway of the home she'd created. The commotion woke 13-year-old Giselle. Terrified, she fled to the living room and tried to hide under a dining table, a child's instinctive response to unimaginable horror. But her brother showed no mercy. He followed her and, as she cowered beneath the table, shot her in the face. Kyle was next. The 16-year-old had woken to a war zone in his own home. He ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, preparing to confront his brother. But he, too, faced the overwhelming power of the shotgun. Nicholas shot him in the chest from a distance, then approached with a knife, inflicting over 100 stab wounds as the teenager begged for his life. Despite catastrophic injuries, including a punctured lung, Kyle managed to fight his way from the kitchen into the hallway, one last desperate bid for survival. There, his brother ended his life with a final shotgun blast to the head. In just a few terrible minutes, Nicholas Prosper had fired 7 shotgun shells, reloading his weapon at least twice to complete the annihilation of his family. The sounds of the struggle, the screaming, the fighting, the impacts, didn't go entirely unnoticed. One neighbor, hearing the disturbance shortly after 50 a.m., came to the apartment door to complain about the noise. She heard thumping and shuffling sounds, along with a boy groaning, then one final sharp crack like a gunshot. The sound drove her back to her own home in fear. The first call to police was made at 5:29 a.m. At 5:33 a.m. Security footage captured Nicholas Prosper leaving the building. He was dressed in a distinctive black and yellow outfit, a costume chosen so he would be remembered and achieve the notoriety central to his plan. In a bag, he carried the reloaded shotgun and 33 remaining shells. He began walking toward St. Joseph's Primary School, his family's blood staining his clothing, his focus now fixed on the main act of his planned rampage. But his scheme was already collapsing. The disturbance at the apartment and the inevitable police response meant the area was already alive with activity. He also realized it was far too early. The school wouldn't be open yet, his intended venue empty. Frustrated, he retreated to a nearby wooded area, hiding himself for over 2 hours as dawn broke over the town he'd meant to terrorize. During this time, at 6:22 a.m., he accessed social media and posted a pre-recorded video. In it, he bizarrely identified himself as a fan of Clementine from the Walking Dead video game series and expressed hatred for his sister Giselle over an incorrect choice she'd made in the game months earlier, vowing that her face would be disfigured beyond what was necessary. He also discarded 2 mobile phones, an action believed to protect an online group he'd been communicating with. Police first arrived at the apartment at 5:50 a.m., entering at 6:08 a.m. Inside, they encountered a scene of unspeakable horror. The bodies of Juliana, Giselle, and Kyle lay amid blood and bloody handprints that documented their final desperate struggles for life. Bloodied knives were scattered throughout the residence, and in one final eerily symbolic gesture, a copy of How to Kill Your Family had been placed on Juliana's body. As investigators were discovering the full scope of violence inside the apartment, Nicholas Prosper realized that heavy police presence meant all nearby schools would be locked down. He understood his elaborate plot was ruined. He abandoned his bag with the shotgun and ammunition in some bushes, and around 7:55 a.m., emerged from hiding onto Birmingham Road. He flagged down a passing police car that happened to be returning from the scene. Officers noticed blood on his face and arrested him immediately. Upon apprehension, he made a strange, revealing statement. "It's not murder." He faced 3 murder charges, plus offenses for unlawfully obtaining and possessing a shotgun, and carrying a bladed weapon in public. An examination of his devices also revealed inappropriate images. But given the severity of his other crimes, no charges were filed regarding these. The legal proceedings that followed were largely procedural, given the overwhelming evidence. During his first court appearance on September 16, 2024, a heartbreaking moment occurred outside the courthouse. His father, Ray Prosper, now alone after losing his wife and 2 children, called out to his son as he was being led away. "I still love you, son. It's not your fault, okay?" Before breaking down in tears. On February 24, 2025, at Luton Crown Court, Nicholas Prosper pleaded guilty to all charges. From behind bars, he expressed remorse not for his actions but for his failures, wishing he had taken more lives. On March 19, 2025, he was brought before the court for sentencing. He initially refused to leave his cell, but Justice Chima Grubb ordered his presence, stating, "You must face the consequences of your actions." In court, he sat with his head in his hands, refusing to stand as his sentence was announced. The judge described his conduct as callous and brutal. Words, she admitted, were inadequate to capture the enormity of his crimes. Speaking to his broader intentions, she told him, "The lives of your own mother and younger siblings were intended to be collateral damage in pursuit of your goal." She imposed a life sentence with a minimum of 49 years. This decision immediately faced criticism. Many people, including the conservative shadow justice minister, believed it was too lenient for such an exceptionally cruel crime, asking, "What does one have to do in this country to receive a full life term?" The Solicitor General referred the sentence to the Court of Appeal under the unduly lenient sentencing scheme, arguing that Prosper's crimes warranted a whole life order, ensuring he would die in prison. The argument was that killing 3 people, 2 of them children, along with plans for a school massacre and aspirations for global notoriety, made the case exceptional. Yet on July 16, 2025, the Court of Appeal rejected the request to increase his sentence. The judicial panel determined that, while the crimes were horrific, the original 49-year minimum was not unduly lenient when considering his age and guilty plea. Nicholas Prosper, the young man who aspired to be one of this century's most notorious killers, was denied his ultimate goal. He's expected to remain imprisoned for life, but was denied the whole life order that would have secured the infamy he so desperately craved. The names that will be remembered are not his, but those of the family he destroyed: Juliana, Kyle, and Giselle Prosper. Their lives, not mere statistics, but the profound and tragic cost of one young man's obsession with death. Story 3. The forest was ancient, its silence deep and watchful. Belanglo State Forest, a vast expanse of pine and eucalyptus trees south of Sydney, had long held a grim place in the collective memory of Australia. It was a location linked with secrets buried beneath the carpet of fallen needles, a name that evoked images of terrible crimes and vanished souls. For decades, it served as the hunting ground of Ivan Milat, the backpacker killer, a monster whose atrocities left an indelible scar on the nation's consciousness. Long after his capture, the woods seemed to hold on to a sinister presence, its shadowed corners whispering tales of those who'd ventured in but never emerged. On August 29, 2010, 2 motorcycle riders carved a path through that unsettling quiet. The roar of their engines was an intrusive presence in the woodland sanctuary. They were seeking recreation, a Sunday afternoon escape from the noise of daily life. Instead, they found its echo, drawn by an irregularity, a slight mound that disrupted the forest's natural landscape. They stopped. Beneath a thin layer of soil and leaf litter lay the skeletal remains of a person. New South Wales police quickly converged on the site. The familiar dread associated with Belanglo's past hung heavy in the air. Early speculation immediately pointed to Milat, but forensic examination quickly ruled that out. The remains were much more recent, placed there well after the serial killer was imprisoned. The skeleton was that of a young woman, She was wearing a t-shirt featuring a distinctive design of an angel cherub, a detail that gave the unidentified deceased her posthumous name, Angel. For 5 long years, that was all she was. A nameless ghost in a forest of horrors. Her identity and her story remained swallowed by the earth. Far away, beneath the vast, merciless skies of South Australia, another mystery awaited discovery. On July 15th, 2015, a driver pulled over along the desolate Karoonda Highway near the tiny, sun-baked hamlet of Winarka. An old, battered suitcase lay abandoned in the dirt and scrub grass, a piece of forgotten luggage in an empty landscape. Curiosity, or perhaps an instinct that something was terribly wrong, drove the motorist to stop and check inside. The lid creaked open to reveal a sight that seized the heart. The delicate, tiny bones of a child wrapped in girl's clothing, and a worn, handmade blanket. 2 discoveries, separated by 1,100 kilometers and half a decade, seemed like just 2 separate, terrible tragedies. One, an unnamed woman in an infamous forest. The other, a small child discarded like trash on a lonely road. No one could have imagined they were mother and child, the beginning and end of the same dreadful story. Their fates woven together by one merciless killer. The long quest to connect them, to restore their identities and uncover the truth, had only just begun. A journey that would lead detectives into a labyrinth of lies, stolen identities, and unthinkable cruelty, peeling back layers from a crime so cold and calculated it would shock the entire nation. The discovery in Winarka sent a shockwave through South Australia's police force. The remains were those of a blonde-haired girl, likely aged 2 to 4 years old, who'd met a violent end long before her small body was abandoned to decompose inside the suitcase. Detectives faced a daunting challenge, identifying a child for whom no one seemed to be searching. Their initial public appeal focused on the few pieces of evidence found with the remains. They released photos of the clothing and, crucially, the distinctive colorful quilt that had been wrapped around her body. It was a long shot, a plea cast into the vast ocean of public awareness. But in this age of constant information flow, sometimes one image can break through the noise. The response was enormous. Over 1,200 calls flooded Crime Stoppers lines. Most were well-meaning but unproductive, until one crucial call changed everything. A woman on the phone recognized that quilt. Her voice trembling, she explained it was hand-sewn. A labor of love created by her own mother for her granddaughter, Candice Kiara Pierce, born in Alice Springs in 2006. With that soul-crushing phone call came an identity for the girl in the suitcase. Candice Kiara Pierce, born in Alice Springs in 2006. This identification was a huge breakthrough, but it revealed another chilling question. If Candice lay in the suitcase, then where was her mother, Carly Jade Pierce Stevenson? Police records showed that Carly's mother had filed a missing persons report on September 4th, 2009, for both of them, but withdrew it on October 9th, the same year after being told Carly was living safely, just desiring no family contact. Armed with Candice's identity, authorities quickly obtained a sample of her DNA from a newborn heel prick test conducted right after her birth, a standard procedure that unexpectedly became a vital clue for solving a larger mystery. They processed the genetic information in the National DNA Database. Their goal was to find her mother, looking for any trace of Carly in the system. They found her, but not as expected. The DNA results showed an exact match with an unidentified deceased person from a different state and time. The sample was linked to the skeletal remains of Angel, discovered in Belanglo State Forest 5 years earlier. 2 separate, horrific incidents suddenly merged into one unified horror story. The Angel from Belanglo was Carly Pierce Stevenson, born in Alice Springs in 1988. The toddler found in a suitcase 1,000 kilometers away was her 2-year-old daughter. They hadn't just vanished. They'd been murdered and disposed of with a horrifying indifference that was hard to comprehend. This discovery sent shockwaves through the police forces of 2 states and struck at the hearts of a grieving family who were about to learn that the hope they'd held onto for years was a cruel and elaborate deception. For years, Carly Pierce Stevenson had lingered as a phantom, a digital ghost. Long after her violent death and burial in the cold ground of Belanglo, her mobile phone remained in use, wielded as a tool of grotesque deception by her killer. Sporadic text messages would appear on the phones of her mother, stepfather, and friends. These messages were infrequent and sometimes emotionally distant, but they were convincing enough to maintain the illusion that Carly was still alive. They portrayed a young woman deliberately keeping her family at arm's length. One message might say she was happy and living in Queensland. Another might be a request for money to fix her car or buy a flight home. A home she had no intention of returning to. Each communication was a calculated, painful jab at her family in Alice Springs. They missed her deeply, but the texts fostered the belief that the separation was her choice. They felt hurt and confused, but respected what they thought was her desire for independence. This heartless charade led Carly's mother to withdraw the missing person report in 2009, a decision that inadvertently gave the killer years of cover. The deception went beyond emotions to finances. As Carly's family worried, her bank account was being steadily drained. Over several years, more than $90,000 was fraudulently taken. The money came from her Centrelink family benefits and other identity theft schemes, all carried out by those responsible for her death. Banking records showed withdrawals and transactions across 4 states and territories, creating a false trail of a nomadic existence. The fraud was bold and shameless. In June 2010, a woman in a wheelchair entered a credit union in Adelaide. Using Carly's identification, she posed as the deceased to withdraw money, accompanied by a man. That same year, another woman did the same at a Centrelink office, using IDs for both Carly and Little Candace to continue government payments. The wheelchair-bound woman was later identified as Hazel Passmore, the new partner of the man police were closing in on. In a tragic and twisted side story, it emerged that Passmore had lost her leg in a car accident in 2008. The driver of that vehicle was the same person who'd killed Carly and Candace. 2 of Passmore's own children died in that crash. The web of lies was intricate and merciless, designed to achieve 2 goals. Ensure a steady flow of money for the killer and convince everyone that Carly Pierce Stevenson was still living. For years, it worked perfectly. While Carly and Candace rested in their remote, unmarked graves, a digital ghost and a team of fraudsters carried on their lives under their names, extending the pain of their family and delaying justice. Before tragedy struck, there was joy. In 2008, Carly Pierce Stevenson was a lively, spirited 20-year-old with a passion for netball and unwavering devotion to her 2-year-old daughter, Candace. Living in Alice Springs, she was known for her energetic nature. She'd attended Breitling Primary School and Alice Springs High School, her life firmly rooted in the tight-knit community of Central Australia's town. But like many young people, she felt drawn to explore beyond the Red Desert. In 2008, accompanied by Candace and with hopes high, Carly decided to leave Alice Springs to travel across Australia, seeking work and building a fresh start for herself and her child. Their travels took them from Darwin to Adelaide, through the Murray and Riverland regions, into Victoria, and finally to Canberra. It was a bold venture, a young mother's courageous leap into unknown territory. But at some point on this trail of hope and new beginnings, her path crossed with that of a man whose own journey was marked by violence and moral depravity. His name was Daniel James Holden. He had a documented history of violence toward women and a dark, disturbing fascination with harm against children. Fantasies he eerily recorded in journals that authorities would eventually discover. He and Carly began a brief, doomed relationship. To outsiders, he might have seemed ordinary, but hidden within was a capacity for extreme and cruel violence. His callous indifference to human life was already on record. In September 2008, just months before he would kill Carly, Hold'em was driving in an accident on the Stewart Highway that resulted in the deaths of 2 children of his then-partner, Hazel Passmore. The last confirmed sighting of Carly and Candace together was in December 2008 in Charnwood, a Canberra suburb. Then Carly vanished. The events of the following days would remain hidden for years, buried in the mind of a murderer and the silent woods of Belanglo. On or around December 14th, 2008, Daniel Hold'em took Carly Pierce Stevenson into the ominous silence of Belanglo State Forest. Only he knows the exact details of that day, but the evidence left behind painted a picture of horrifying savagery. During his court hearing years later, it was claimed that Hold'em confessed to a witness what he'd done. He attacked Carly, applying pressure to her chest and throat by stepping or kneeling with such tremendous force that he crushed her trachea, ending her life in the forest. But for Hold'em, the killing alone wasn't enough. In a final display of twisted dominance, he took commemorative photographs of Carly's body, pictures of his prey that law enforcement would later discover on a digital camera's memory card. He then dug a shallow grave and buried her, leaving her to become the unidentified figure that motorcyclists would accidentally find almost 2 years later. Justice Robert Hulme, the judge who would ultimately sentence him, described his actions as showing total contempt for her humanity, noting that to Hold'em, she was merely flesh whose life could be snuffed out for his abhorrent gratification. With Carly dead and buried, Hold'em was left with her 2-year-old daughter, Candace. He told others he was taking the toddler to South Australia to be cared for by her grandmother. Another lie in an ever-expanding web of deception. A few days after killing her mother, Hold'em and Candace checked into a motel in Narrandera, a town in New South Wales Riverina region. It was there between December 19th and 20th that he ended the child's life. His method was one of suffocating cruelty. He visited a supermarket to buy duct tape and garbage bags. Within the privacy of the motel room, he forced dishcloths into the 2-year-old's mouth and wrapped a disposable diaper around her head, silencing her forever. He then compressed her tiny body into a suitcase, the same one a driver would spot beside a highway almost 7 years later. He drove hundreds of kilometers across state lines into South Australia before dumping the suitcase near Winarka, leaving Candace's remains to be discovered by chance in the vast, empty landscape. The killings, as prosecutor Mark Tedeschi would later argue, resembled thrill murders. Acts so horrific, despicable, heinous, seriously condemnable, and profoundly evil that they ranked among the worst crimes imaginable. By October 2015, the scattered pieces of the investigation had been put together. Law enforcement had identified both victims and gained a full understanding of the extensive deception carried out after their deaths. All that remained was to hold the responsible person accountable. The joint investigation, a massive collaborative effort involving police from NSW, SANNT, was tightening its grip. The electronic trail of lies Hold'em had carefully built to hide his crimes ultimately led to his downfall. Mobile phone tower data placed him in Belanglo Forest when Carly died. Financial records linked the stolen money back to him and his associate, Hazel Passmore, and most damningly, an informant came forward to reveal that Hold'em had confessed to the murders. The discovery of the SD card containing the disturbing photos of Carly's body in the woods sealed his guilt. On October 28, 2015, Daniel James Hold'em was arrested in Cessnock, NSW, and charged with murdering Carly Pierce Stevenson. He was already in custody on unrelated charges. On December 15th, he was also charged with Candace's murder. The man who'd remained free for 7 years after committing 2 of Australia's most monstrous murders was finally behind bars. His legal proceedings moved slowly through the judicial system. The case file spanned 5 volumes and comprised 42 binders. His committal hearing in August 2017 exposed the powerful combination of circumstantial evidence and direct confessions leveled against him. A 3-month trial was scheduled to begin in August 2018. However, just days before it was set to start, on July 31, 2018, Daniel Holdom took the only action that could spare Carly and Candilesa's family from the trauma of a lengthy and graphic trial. He pleaded guilty to both murders. On November 30th, 2018, Holdom appeared before the NSW Supreme Court for sentencing Gaudoit. In a final desperate move, his lawyer attempted to withdraw the guilty plea for Candilesa's murder, but the judge promptly rejected the request. Justice Robert Holm proceeded to deliver a scathing condemnation of Holdom's crimes. He described Carly's murder as an act of utmost seriousness and shocking wickedness, and noted that evidence of a repulsive intent in Candilesa's killing made it even more abhorrent. Recognizing Holdom's history of violence and total lack of remorse, he imposed the only sentence fitting for the crimes: 2 consecutive life terms without any possibility of parole. When the verdict was announced, cheers erupted from the public gallery. Outside the courthouse, Carly and Candilesa's family released a statement. "His cruelty will haunt us forever," they said. "No action taken against him will bring back Carly and Candileja or make up for our pain. He has forfeited his right to live." This sentiment echoed throughout Australia. Justice had been served, but for the families of the deceased, the pain would never fully fade. The story of Carly and Candileja stands as a chilling reminder of the evil that can lurk undetected and the enduring power of a love that death could not extinguish. Story 4. The quiet suburban street in Melbourne South seemed deceptively peaceful on that clear June day in 2007. The winter sun, hanging low in the Australian sky, cast long, sharp shadows across the neat brick homes and well-kept gardens. This was a neighborhood of ordinary lives, where children played and neighbors exchanged friendly words over garden fences. But within the walls of 14 Oakley Drive, an eerie silence had settled. A silence so deep it felt as though it swallowed all the light and warmth from the afternoon. It was in this silence that a life had been violently ended, and a dark, watchful presence was just beginning its long 17-year vigil. Philip Crosthwaite's hands trembled as he reached toward the door of his daughter's home. A knot of fear had been tightening in his gut since morning. Cindy, his vibrant, loving Cindy, hadn't answered his calls. This was completely out of character for her. She was a devoted mother, and her 3 children meant everything to her. She wouldn't just vanish without a word. He'd rushed over, a father's intuition screaming that something was terribly wrong. The door was unlocked, a small detail that sent another wave of panic through him. He called out her name, his voice echoing through the disturbingly still house. "Cindy, Cindy, are you home?" The only response was a soft crying sound from the back of the house. It was the cry of his youngest grandchild, Jonas, only 13 months old. Following the sound, Philip moved through the home that used to echo with his daughter's laughter. He found Jonas in his playpen, his tiny face wet with tears, his diaper soiled and unchanged. He'd been alone for hours, and then, just steps away, Philip saw her. Cindy Crosthwaite was lying on the floor, her body twisted in a way that denied any hope of life. She'd been savagely beaten, her face showing evidence of unspeakable violence. But it was the small, dark hole in her skull that revealed the final horrifying truth. She'd been shot at close range, an execution-style killing in the safety of her own home. The world seemed to tilt for Philip Crosthwaite. In that one heart-crushing moment, his life and those of his family were forever shattered. He scooped up his grandson, the small, living warmth of the baby standing in stark contrast to the cold finality of what lay before him, and stumbled outside into the fading daylight. his mind reeling with one terrible question. Who could have done this? But somewhere deep inside, beyond all reason and logic, he already knew the answer. It was a name that would haunt his every waking moment and fuel a relentless 17-year quest for justice. Emil Petrov. Emil Bill Petrov and Cindy Crosswaite's relationship began like so many others, full of promise and hope. They married and welcomed two beautiful children into their lives, a son and a daughter named Jessie. To outsiders, they looked like any other family. But within the privacy of their home, a different reality was unfolding. The love that once bound them together soured over time into a toxic mix of control, bitterness, and fear. Emil was someone who demanded dominance. His love came with conditions. His anger always simmered just beneath the surface. Cindy, described by those close to her as pure sunshine and kindness, a woman without malice, found her spirit fading under the heavy shadow of her husband's control. She was a devoted mother, putting her children first, which seemed to irritate Emil. His love wasn't liberating. It was confining. By 2005, the confinement became unbearable. Cindy found the courage to leave, taking her two children with her. She was escaping, reaching for a life where she and her children could exist without fear. But for someone like Emil Petrov, this wasn't an ending. It was an act of defiance. Her departure represented an unforgivable betrayal, a challenge to his control that he couldn't tolerate. The period after their separation was marked by a bitter, drawn-out battle in family court. They fought over custody of their children and division of their assets. For Cindy, it was about securing a safe, stable future. For Emil, it was about dominance and revenge. He hated losing, and he made sure Cindy knew it. The legal battles became a stage for his growing rage. He began threatening her, his words edged with a quiet, sinister warning. He told her she'd pay for leaving him. He told her she wouldn't live to see the end of their court battle. These weren't idle words from a spurned partner. They were promises. Cindy, ever hopeful, tried to build a fresh start. She found love again with Daniel Hines. And they had a son, Jonas, together. She was creating the happy, peaceful family she'd always wanted for her children. But the shadow of her ex-husband loomed large. The threats continued, a constant undercurrent of fear in her renewed life. She took them seriously, documenting incidents and sharing concerns with loved ones. She knew Emil's capacity for violence. She knew his ego had been wounded, and that a man of his nature would go to extreme lengths to repair his damaged pride. As the legal proceedings dragged on endlessly, Emil's desperation grew. The court system wasn't bending to his will. He was losing control, and the thought of Cindy winning, of her building a happy life without him, was intolerable. The deep hatred he harbored for her festered, transforming into a lethal obsession. He decided that if she couldn't be his, then she would be no one's. And if the courts wouldn't give him victory, he would find another way to settle the score. A final, savage way that would silence her forever. The plan was cold, calculated, and cruel. Emil Petrov didn't want to get his hands dirty if he could avoid it. He was a planner, a puppeteer. He found a partner in crime, an old acquaintance named Brian O'Shea. In the months leading up to the killing, Emil began to communicate his thoughts. He shared his ideas with O'Shea, not seeking advice but gauging reactions, planting the first seeds of his dark plans. He talked about his hatred for Cindy, his frustration with the legal system, and eventually his desire for her death. O'Shea would later testify in court that these conversations became increasingly detailed and explicit. Emil wasn't just venting frustration, he was crafting a strategy. He spoke of a job that needed doing. He reportedly showed O'Shea an outfit he planned to wear, an eerie prop in a real-life drama. He was preparing for the final act, a carefully planned murder staged to look like a botched burglary. On June 20th, 2007, the plan was set in motion. Whether it was Emil Petrov himself who entered that brick house on Oakley Drive or an unknown assassin he'd hired, the intent was the same. The killer entered the home, a home where a mother was caring for her 3 children, and unleashed a wave of violence. Cindy was brutally beaten, an intensely personal assault that suggested deep, boiling rage. It was an act of hatred that went beyond the cold efficiency of a hired killing. It was intimate. And then, as she lay helpless on the floor of her own home, mere steps from her infant son, a gun was placed against her head. A single gunshot rang out, a final punctuation mark to a life ended too soon. The killer, having completed his mission, disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene of unspeakable horror and a baby boy alone with his murdered mother. The silence that followed was broken only by the cries of a child too young to understand the magnitude of the tragedy that had just occurred. Cindy Crosswaite, 41 years old and mother of 3 children, a woman full of joy and hope, was dead. Emil Petrov had achieved his goal. He'd silenced her forever. He'd won at last. The investigation into Cindy Crosswaite's murder began immediately, but faced obstacles from the start. Investigators suspected foul play beyond what met the eye. Evidence pointed toward a burglary, but detectives remained unconvinced. The amount of violence directed specifically at Cindy before she received the fatal gunshot suggested something more personal than theft. This led them quickly to suspect Emil Petrov, who had strong motives stemming from bitter custody disputes and property division, along with a documented history of threatening behavior toward his ex-wife, making him the top suspect. But suspicion isn't proof. Despite being calm and composed during questioning, denying everything while providing a solid alibi supported by a meticulously crafted timeline placing him elsewhere when the crime occurred, plus the absence of physical traces connecting him to the scene, no weapon recovered, and no confession obtained, authorities were stumped. Even after interviewing Brian O'Shea, who'd supposedly heard the murder plot confessed, but chose to remain silent and denied any knowledge, police had only a circumstantial case and couldn't proceed further. The investigation came to a standstill, causing immense suffering for family members, especially Philip Crosswaite, who discovered his daughter's body and was haunted daily, replaying the traumatic events in his mind, that searing image never fading. Knowing deep down the guilt belonged to one man, he said years later through tears, "It's been so hard knowing he was guilty from the time I found her body until now." The children grew up overshadowed by the unresolved tragedy. Daughter Jessie longed to someday see the perpetrator punished. Son Jonas, an infant present during the incident, matured without memories of his mom, defined instead by the void left behind, a constant reminder of the cruelty endured, spending hours beside his dead mother, a devastating impact that would last a lifetime, a wound left unhealed, justice remaining elusive. A decade passed. The investigation grew cold, filed away as a forgotten case in the police department's archives. Emil Petrov remained free, likely believing he'd escaped justice and that the years had washed away his sins. He'd managed to remove his ex-wife from his life, and it seemed he would never face consequences. But the spark of hope, though faint, never died completely. The detectives assigned to the case never forgot Cindy Crosswaite, and her family kept fighting. They continued engaging with the media to keep her story alive, determined not to let her become just another cold case statistic. They held on to faith that one day there would be a breakthrough. Someday, the truth would emerge. In 2017, a full 10 years after the killing, their persistence bore fruit. Victoria Police, in a fresh effort to crack the case, announced a $1 million reward for information leading to a conviction. This was a life-changing sum of money, a powerful incentive for anyone with knowledge to break their silence. The announcement revived public interest and placed significant pressure on those possibly hiding crucial information. Someone knew what happened that day in Melton South. And for the first time in 10 years, there was real hope they might be persuaded to come forward. The long period of silence was drawing to a close. The ghost of justice was awakening. The $1 million reward acted like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of consequence everywhere. The renewed media attention and substantial reward created an atmosphere of intense pressure. For people like Brian O'Shea, who'd carried the weight of Emil Petrov's dark secret for 10 years, the walls were closing in. In 2019, 12 years after the murder, the investigation gained momentum it hadn't seen since its beginning. Investigators, armed with fresh leads and renewed determination, took action. They arrested 2 people, Emil Petrov and his former associate, Brian O'Shea. Both were charged with the murder of Cindy Crosswaite. The arrests sent shockwaves through the community and rekindled hope within Cindy's surviving family. It seemed that the wheels of justice, after stalling for so many years, were finally turning again. The prosecution now had a powerful tool. 2 co-defendants they could turn against each other under threat of life imprisonment. The strategy worked. Faced with the prospect of being convicted for a murder he claimed he didn't commit, Brian O'Shea made a pivotal choice that changed the trajectory of the case. He agreed to testify against Emil Petrov. This was the breakthrough detectives had waited over 10 years to achieve. O'Shea's testimony provided the missing piece, the key that would unlock the truth. His murder charge was dramatically dropped, and he became the prosecution's star witness. The case against Emil Petrov, previously based only on circumstantial evidence, was now strengthened by the explosive testimony of someone who claimed to have been involved in every step of the plot. The trial against Emil Petrov began in November 2024. The courtroom was packed. On one side sat Cindy's family, their faces reflecting grief, tension, and anticipation. They'd waited for this day for 17 years. Across from them sat Emil Petrov, now 60 years old. A man who'd enjoyed nearly 2 decades of freedom after orchestrating his ex-wife's death. He pleaded not guilty, maintaining the facade of innocence he'd sustained for so long. The prosecution team, driven by determined attorneys, presented their case with meticulous precision. They portrayed Emil Petrov as a man consumed by profound hatred, driven by revenge and an urgent need for control. They introduced evidence of the bitter family court battle, his threats against Cindy, and the grim finality of her killing. Then they called their star witness. Brian O'Shea took the stand as silence filled the courtroom. He told jurors about Emil's escalating fury, conversations where he first broached murderous intentions, and recounted when Emil supposedly showed him a disguise intended for use, an element that lent an eerie reality to their conspiracy. O'Shea's testimony formed the central pillar of the prosecution's case, providing direct evidence linking Petrov to both the planning and execution of his former wife's death. The defense countered aggressively, challenging O'Shea's credibility and portraying him as an untrustworthy individual, ready to say anything for self-preservation. They argued there was no physical evidence connecting Petrov to the crime scene, claiming O'Shea invented his story to secure the $1 million reward for himself. Petrov maintained his denial throughout, projecting an image of wounded innocence. For 3 weeks, the jury absorbed the conflicting accounts, hearing from forensic experts, police officers, and friends and family who'd known and cherished Cindy. They were presented with 2 radically different versions of events. The prosecution's story of a calculated, ruthless killing contrasted with the defense's portrayal of an innocent man framed by a deceitful person. After a 17-year wait, the trial was finally handed to the jury. For Cindy's family, the anticipation was unbearable. They had endured so much, and now the fate of the man they believed to be evil rested in the hands of 12 strangers. They sat together, breath held, hoping for the justice that had eluded them for years. On December 11, 2024, the jury returned their verdict. The court clerk announced the one powerful word: guilty. A tremendous surge of emotion swept through the courtroom. Loud cries of relief erupted from the gallery where Cindy's family sat. Their faces were wet with tears. Tears of relief, sorrow, and 17 years of suppressed pain were finally released. They embraced one another, a wordless acknowledgement of their shared victory. Jessie Crosswaite, the daughter who dreamed of this day for most of her life, finally felt a measure of peace. Philip Crosswaite, the father who'd carried the burden of his discovery for so long, at last saw the man he knew to be guilty face consequences. Emil Petrov, who'd shown no emotion during the proceedings, remained stoic. But his world had collapsed. After 17 years of freedom, he was now officially a convicted murderer. He would spend his first night and countless others behind bars. The long arm of justice had finally caught up with him. Emil Petrov's sentencing occurred on April 16, 2025. He appeared before Justice Christopher Beale, the person who would decide his fate. Cindy's family attended, as they had for every trial session, to witness the final chapter of their long ordeal. Emil Petrov, still defiant, continued to deny any involvement, his pride unshaken despite his conviction. Justice Beale's task was to sentence a man for murder, but the case contained a legal nuance. While the jury had convicted Petrov of murder, the judge personally wasn't entirely convinced that Petrov had been the actual killer. The evidence suggested his role in planning the crime, but it was possible he'd hired an unknown assassin. Therefore, Justice Beale sentenced Petrov under the premise that he'd engaged in a joint criminal enterprise to commit murder. At the very least, you were complicit in the deliberate killing of your estranged wife and mother of your 2 young children in her own home. Justice Beale stated, his tone filled with condemnation. There's no doubt that your actions represent a serious case of murder. He highlighted the aggravating factors: Petrov's threats, the ongoing hostile family court battle, and the brutal nature of the act. For Cindy's family, whether he was the direct killer or the mastermind made no difference. I'm certain he did it regardless of what the judge thinks, Jessie said outside the courthouse. No one else could have done such a thing. Her grandfather Philip echoed this sentiment with unwavering conviction in Petrov's direct responsibility. Justice Beale imposed a sentence of 26 years imprisonment on Emil Petrov, with a non-parole period of 20 years. As the sentence was announced, Petrov showed no reaction. But for Cindy's family, it was a moment of profound yet partial closure. 20 years. It wasn't enough to bring back Cindy or undo 17 years of suffering, but it meant something. Accountability and justice. Jonas Hines, once a baby found in a playpen and now a young man, stood outside as a quiet presence. Raised in the shadow of a crime he couldn't remember, he felt underwhelmed by the outcome, saying, "It's the best we can get under the circumstances." The loss was evident as he added, "I still don't have my mom. Nothing can fix that. His father, Daniel Hines, remembered the woman he loved, describing her as pure joy and kindness, asserting she lacked malice, and was a devoted mother focused solely on her children. The case of Emil Petrov stands as proof of the lasting strength of family devotion and the unyielding quest for justice. Over 17 long years, they preserved Cindy's memory, ensuring she wasn't forgotten, confronting the painful silence of an unsolved case and the anguish of watching her murderer walk free. The emotional toll of the public and legal battle was immense. Their victory came hard, a bittersweet end to a tragic tale. Emil Petrov, who assumed he'd escape punishment for murder, will age in prison. The malice that prompted him to end a vibrant soul has confined him to a barren cell. The long darkness he cast upon the Crosswaite family for almost 20 years has finally been replaced by the unwavering light of justice. Cindy Crosswaite, the mother The daughter, the friend, the person radiating joy and hope can now rest in peace. Story 5. In the vibrant spring of 2007, London was a vast metropolis brimming with endless possibilities, a place where dreams were pursued and futures were built. For Kate Beagley, 32, it was a city she navigated with grace and confidence. As a successful sales manager at Centrica, the holding company of British Gas, Kate embodied the modern woman. Intelligent, ambitious, and full of life. Those who knew her would describe her as energetic, thoughtful, and deeply loyal. She had a magnetic personality that lit up any room. Her laughter infectious, her determination unwavering. Kate was godmother to 2 children and hoped one day to have a family of her own. Her life was a rich tapestry of career success, meaningful friendships with close friends, and loving family. On the evening of May 18th, 2007, Kate was out with friends at the CC Club in London's Piccadilly, a popular spot in the heart of the city's nightlife. The club pulsed with music and conversation, a swirl of different people and stories. It was there that Kate met Carl Taylor, a 27-year-old personal trainer and youth football coach. Taylor was a regular at the club and would later boast in court about his way with women. That evening they danced and talked, a spark of connection in the crowded space. They exchanged numbers and arranged a proper date a few days later, set for the evening of May 30th, a seemingly unremarkable Wednesday. Kate, always punctual and considerate, likely looked forward to it with a mix of excitement and cautious optimism. She was someone who embraced life's opportunities for connection. That night, she drove her gray Volkswagen Golf to meet Taylor in Chiswick, a leafy, affluent neighborhood in West London. They had a drink at a local pub to start their evening together. Afterwards, Kate drove them to Richmond Hill, famous for its stunning views of the River Thames. They had another drink at the Roebuck Pub, an old establishment at the top of the hill, then decided on a short walk to a bench overlooking the river. The setting was beautiful, a romantic landscape that had inspired artists and poets for generations. But on this night, the spot's beauty would be forever tainted by an act of unspeakable brutality. As they sat on the bench beneath the fading light, something shifted. A witness later told police that during their date, Kate seemed distracted, head down as she texted on her phone with little conversation between them. Taylor seemed to lack the attention he desired. When Kate announced she was leaving, the evening turned to terror. Unknown to Kate, impossible for her to foresee, Carl Taylor had come armed with a carving knife concealed up his sleeve. He claimed he brought it to steal her car, yet the ferocity of his actions suggested far darker intentions. In a frenzied attack, he repeatedly stabbed her, 31 times in her face and neck. The assault was swift and vicious, a devastating explosion of violence that ended the life of this vibrant young woman in moments. The bench and surrounding grass were soaked with her blood, a stark testament to the horror in that peaceful, scenic spot. After the murder, Taylor's actions were cold and calculated. He dragged or carried Kate's lifeless body to her vehicle and placed it in the trunk. Then he drove her car, her body still inside, to Oxhey Wood, a secluded wooded area in Hertfordshire just north of London. There, he left her body among nettles, exposed to the elements. In a disturbing detail later revealed, he washed her body with mineral water, a twisted attempt to remove his DNA and, as he claimed, to spiritually purify her under the stars. With Kate's body hidden, Taylor began erasing traces of his crime. He threw the murder weapon out his car window while on the motorway. He also discarded her clothes and other items along the M1, but his main focus shifted to personal gain. He had Kate's car, mobile phone, and Marks and Spencer vouchers from her glove compartment, and he quickly acted as if everything was normal. He drove the stolen VW Golf, showing it off to friends and family. He called his girlfriend, Lauren Chunlock, mere minutes after the murder, sounding casual as he mentioned his new vehicle. He sold Kate's phone to an acquaintance and distributed the stolen vouchers to his mother. He was, as later described by the judge, egotistical, manipulative, and extremely dangerous. While Taylor enjoyed his criminal spoils, alarm was growing among Kate's circle. Kate was a person of habit, a reliable and communicative individual who would never disappear without explanation. When she failed to show up at work and couldn't be reached by phone, her family and friends knew something was terribly wrong. They launched an urgent search, using social media to broadcast their appeal for any information. The following days were a blur of fear and anxious waiting, marked by an agonizing wait for news. Police officials were also growing increasingly concerned. Friends had been receiving text messages from Kate's mobile phone, but the content seemed out of character. The wording was different and the style wasn't hers, which immediately raised suspicion. Authorities began their investigation, and a search of Kate's home uncovered another phone. Detectives from the Missing Persons Unit started examining the contacts on this device, one of which was connected to a man she dated on the evening she disappeared, Carl Taylor. When first contacted by police, Taylor promptly answered his phone. He said that he'd met Kate for a date, but that she'd driven him home and he hadn't seen her since. However, his story soon began to fall apart. Officers interviewed his mother, who told them that Taylor had come home in the early hours of May 31st, driving an unfamiliar vehicle, a Volkswagen Golf. She also mentioned that he'd been cleaning the car, explaining he needed to make it presentable for a woman who needed it to transport her children to school. This was an obvious lie. The vehicle belonged to Kate, who was now missing. If there were an innocent explanation for him having her car, why hadn't he mentioned it to police? The case against Taylor began to build. The shopping vouchers he'd given his mother had come from Kate's glove compartment. The car he was proudly showing off was hers. Her phone, which he'd sold to an acquaintance, was another piece of incriminating evidence. Police logs showed that her car had been spotted just before midnight on May 30th, swerving erratically over Chiswick Bridge in the direction away from Kate's home. As time passed, hope of finding Kate alive faded, replaced by the grim realization that she'd likely been harmed. Police knew they had to bring Taylor in for questioning, but the man who'd once been so responsive to calls was now unreachable and ignoring their attempts to contact him. Taylor was arrested, and during questioning, his defenses began to crumble. He eventually agreed to lead them to Kate's remains. On June 4th, 5 days after her disappearance, investigators found Kate's body in a wooded area near Watford. The sight was deeply distressing. Her body was discovered discarded among nettles. The location was immediately secured as a crime scene, and forensic experts began the painstaking task of collecting evidence. Because of the warm May weather and the advanced state of decomposition, Kate could only be officially identified through her DNA. The discovery of her body sent waves of grief through her family and friends. Her parents, Alan and Claire, and her brother, Guy, released a statement describing Kate as a loving, thoughtful, reliable, loyal, and much-loved daughter, sister, granddaughter, godmother, and friend who was deeply devoted to her family and friends. They expressed the profound emptiness her death had left in their lives, a void that could never be filled. Tributes in the form of flowers and messages were left at the crime scene, showing how deeply this loss affected the community. One message read, "I never knew you personally, but feel as though I've known you forever. My deepest sympathies to all who were lucky enough to know your love and friendship. This world feels emptier without you." The autopsy revealed the full extent of the horror Kate endured. She'd sustained over 30 stab wounds to her neck, face, and head, a brutal and sustained attack. This revelation was devastating for those close to her, who now had to face the violent truth of how she died. The police investigation continued. With Taylor's help, they reconstructed the events of that tragic night. He showed them a pub on Richmond Hill and pointed out the bench where he'd attacked Kate. Blood found on the bench, steps, and handrails leading back to the pub was tested and confirmed as Kate's. He also revealed where her car could be found. It was recovered from an estate in Hounslow, London. Remarkably, authorities also located the murder weapon, which Taylor had thrown from his car on the motorway, along with some of her clothing and water bottles used in washing her body. Her blood was detected on the knife. With overwhelming evidence against him, Carl Taylor faced charges for murdering Kate Beagley. Yet, in an action that would add to her family's anguish, he pleaded not guilty, claiming self-defense and alleging that Kate had taken her own life. The case went to trial at the Old Bailey, where over 2 weeks, jurors heard harrowing testimony detailing Kate's final moments. The prosecution built a compelling case, offering the jury an overwhelming amount of evidence pointing to Taylor's guilt. They explained to the jury how Taylor and Kate had met at the CC Club and scheduled their date. They described the scene at the pub on Richmond Hill, with a witness confirming that Kate seemed to be ignoring Taylor by texting on her phone. They recounted the vicious attack on the bench and Taylor's detached and deliberate behavior afterward, including taking her car, disposing of her body, and selling her belongings. The prosecution also emphasized Taylor's confession to law enforcement, which he was now trying to retract. They reminded the jury that Taylor had arrived at the date carrying a concealed carving knife, a clear sign of premeditation. The judge, Giles Forrester, would later state your use of the knife was premeditated, and it was concealed on your person. Then, after committing this terrible deed, you removed and callously hid this body, deepening the suffering of her family and friends. Taylor testified in his own defense, spinning an implausible and deeply cynical story. He claimed that Kate was unhappy with her life and had planned to take her own life. He presented himself as a concerned witness who'd tried to intervene, but her wounds were so severe that she couldn't have inflicted them on herself without collapsing. His account wasn't just unbelievable. It was an insult to Kate's memory and a cruel torture for her grieving family. The trial's climax came when the prosecution asked Taylor to demonstrate for the court how Kate could have stabbed herself over 30 times in the face, head, and neck. They handed him a rolled-up piece of paper to simulate a knife and told him to show exactly how she'd supposedly done it. He refused, but the judge ordered it. His attempt to depict the impossible was described as absurd and humiliating, a pathetic and desperate attempt to escape responsibility for his crime. The jury saw through his lies. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder. Applause erupted from the public gallery as the verdict was announced, a collective expression of relief and affirmation of truth. Before sentencing, a victim impact statement from Kate's father, Alan, was read in court. In it, he conveyed the profound impact of his daughter's death, the emptiness and pointlessness that now filled their lives. Kate was so full of life and spirit, he wrote. She was godmother to 2 children and hoped one day to have her own family. He spoke of the unimaginable pain of her final moments, what she must have suffered in those last seconds as she was brutally attacked. He ended by saying, "The consequences of this callous and vicious attack have permanently changed countless lives." Judge Giles Forrester imposed a life sentence on Carl Taylor with a minimum term of 30 years. In his sentencing remarks, he characterized Taylor as arrogant, deceitful, and extremely dangerous. He told him, "You met this girl armed with a knife. She was simply seeking companionship from you." Story 6. The salty breeze of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, carries the promise of sun-soaked days and carefree living. This is a city built on tourists, a place of fleeting joy and warm weather memories. But beneath the bright facade of pastel-colored condos and bustling boardwalks, dark currents can swirl, pulling people into unexpected and terrifying depths. For Gregory Greg Vincent Rice, a 46-year-old father of 5 children, Myrtle Beach was home. a place where he was raising his family and living a life marked by devotion to them. Greg was someone who found his greatest happiness in the simple moments spent with his kids. His friends described him as the kind of dad who always had his children on the weekends. By all accounts, they were the center of his universe. Originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, Greg had an easygoing, outdoorsy nature with a love for golf and surfing that fit the coastal lifestyle he built. He'd been in a long-term relationship with Megan Jackson, a 15-year partnership that had produced 4 children together: Zachary, Savannah, Dakota, and Madison, in addition to Greg's son from a previous relationship. Even after their romantic relationship ended, they maintained a joint custody arrangement, a delicate and often strained dance of co-parenting that defined their interactions. Their post-breakup life was a tapestry of tense digital exchanges and scheduled handoffs, a fragile balance maintained for the children they both claimed to love. The first weekend of October 2020 was supposed to be routine. On Saturday, October 3rd, Megan Jackson arrived at Greg's home in the quiet Arrowhead neighborhood to drop off the children for his scheduled weekend visit. But when she knocked on the door, there was no answer. Greg, the consistently reliable father, was nowhere to be found. Megan later told law enforcement she found this unusual, saying she'd spoken with him just the night before. A growing sense of unease took hold. Greg's friend, Ryan McNew, would later testify that this behavior was completely out of character for him. Greg almost always had the kids on weekends, Ryan noted. This was his top priority. Disturbed, or so she claimed, Megan Jackson filed a missing person report. When detectives arrived at the apartment, the scene was oddly normal except for one peculiar detail. Greg's keys were found wedged into a couch cushion on his front porch. It was as though he'd vanished into thin air, leaving only the faintest trace of his presence behind. The investigation began as a standard missing person case, but an ominous remark Greg had shared with his friend Ryan before disappearing cast a dark shadow over everything. Greg told me that if anything happened to him, he didn't take his own life, Ryan recalled. It was an eerie premonition, a grim warning suggesting Greg himself sensed danger. As investigators dug into the final hours before his disappearance, their attention quickly turned to the person who'd reported him missing, Megan Jackson. Her occupation was an unusual one. She worked for a body transport company, a career that familiarized her with the practicalities of death. Security footage from Greg's area showed her work van, the vehicle she used for transporting bodies, leaving the neighborhood in the early morning hours of October 3rd, days before she officially filed the missing person report. Additionally, tracking Greg's cell phone showed it left his residence and traveled alongside her phone that same night. Under questioning, Megan offered an alibi. She said she'd spent the entire night with Christopher Dontel, a married deputy coroner for Horry County who was her co-worker. But this defense, intended to deflect suspicion, instead unleashed a treasure trove of hidden truths, lies, and forbidden desire. Officials would soon discover that Megan Jackson and Chris Dontel were more than just co-workers. They'd been involved in a secret affair for nearly a year. The relationship began in late 2019, after they met while working at the same body transport company in 2018. Their connection quickly transcended professional boundaries. By Christmas that year, the affair had intensified, and Megan, in a bold move for closeness, relocated to the same neighborhood as Dontel and his wife, Erica. She cultivated a friendship with Erica, integrating herself into their household by offering financial help and becoming a trusted confidant, all while conducting a hidden affair with Erica's husband. The duplicity was staggering in its scope. The already toxic mix of lies became even more explosive due to several anonymous texts Erica Dontel received just before Greg's disappearance. "Think you should know that your husband is having an affair and got somebody pregnant," one message stated. Another followed, deepening the wound. "Oh, and I think you should know it's Megan Jackson." When confronted, Megan and Chris denied everything. Megan, skilled at manipulation, blamed Greg. telling the Dantels that she suspected her ex was sending the messages to create chaos in her life. This was a lie designed to shift blame and portray Greg as a dangerous and unstable person, a narrative she would maintain as her life began to unravel. For more than a month, the search for Greg Rice produced no results. His family and friends endured an excruciating wait, their hope fading with each passing day. Then, on November 7th, 2020, the mystery of his disappearance reached a gruesome conclusion. In the murky, sluggish waters of the Little PD River, a woman named Donna Shockley was fishing with her family when they noticed something wrapped in a tarp near the shore. It looked like the tarp had just been dropped there, she told reporters later. Curiosity turned to horror when they used an oar to lift one edge of the bundle. That's when we saw the ratchet straps tied around the lower parts of the legs and around the head on the other side. The body, weighted down with cinder blocks, was quickly identified. It was Greg Rice. An autopsy revealed the brutal truth. Greg hadn't just been killed, he'd been executed. The medical examiner detected 5 gunshot wounds across his body. 2 in his hip, 1 in his chest, 1 in his thigh, and a final fatal shot to the head. The missing person investigation had become a murder probe, and the web of deception woven by Megan Jackson and Chris Dontel was beginning to ensnare them. The materials used to conceal Greg's body became the key piece of evidence. Law enforcement determined that the tarp, ratchet straps, and cinder blocks had all been purchased from a local hardware store. Security footage from the shop was retrieved, and the video was damning. There on tape was Deputy Coroner Chris Dontel buying every item used to sink and dispose of his lover's ex-boyfriend. Armed with this solid proof, authorities took action. Both Megan Jackson and Chris Dontel were arrested and charged with murdering Greg Rice. Dontel was immediately fired from his position as deputy coroner. As the investigation progressed, a search of Megan's home revealed not just evidence connected to the murder, an empty gun case for a handgun matching the murder weapon, but also the deeply troubling conditions under which she was raising her children. Investigators found that alarms were installed on the children's bedroom doors that would sound if open. Locks were fitted on the outside of their doors, and their windows had been nailed shut. The pantry was also locked. It was a home that had become a prison. Based on these discoveries, Megan faced 4 charges of unlawful conduct toward a child, and her children were placed in emergency protective custody. They would eventually go to live with their older half-brother, Zachary, who had to shoulder the enormous burden of raising his 4 younger siblings following their father's murder and their mother's arrest. Even while under house arrest, the toxic connection between Megan and Chris remained strong. They frequently violated court orders, meeting secretly. They couldn't stay away from each other, officials noted, even as the consequences of their actions closed in around them. The legal proceedings moved at a slow pace. But in December 2024, the case took a sudden turn. On the eve of his own murder trial, Chris Dontel broke down. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges, accessory after the fact to murder and conspiracy to commit murder. In exchange, he agreed to become the state's star witness, vowing to testify against the woman he'd once loved. Megan Jackson's trial for first-degree murder and Greg Rice's death began in June 2025. She pleaded not guilty. Her legal team prepared to argue that insufficient evidence existed to convict her, and that the prosecution's entire case rested on the testimony of one unreliable man, Chris Dontel, alone. The prosecution team, led by prosecutors, aimed to portray Megan as a cold, calculating killer motivated by hatred, a woman determined to remove her ex-boyfriend permanently from her path. The courtroom proceedings became a display of intense legal drama. But its most stunning moment came when Chris Dontel testified under oath. The prosecution systematically unraveled Megan's elaborate fabric of lies. They presented exchanges between her and Dontel that hinted at plans to harm Greg. Forensic expert Ben Wells testified that examination of Megan's personal cell phone confirmed she was the sender of the anonymous messages to Erica Donto. A calculated attempt to frame Greg and manipulate her lover's wife. Prosecutor arguments contended that Megan was the sole person who benefited from Greg's death, asserting that every piece of evidence pointed to her malice and careful planning. The defense, led by attorney Preston Burrows, countered, claiming Dontel had the motive to eliminate Greg and was unreliable. The only basis for convicting her rests on trusting that man, and I don't believe you can, Burrows told the jury in his closing arguments. Megan Jackson chose not to testify in her own defense. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from Savannah Rice, the teenage daughter of Greg and Megan. Testifying against her mother, she spoke about the hardships she and her siblings had endured, and the void left by their father, who'd been their rock. This crime has devastated my family, other families, and friends beyond measure, she later said in a victim impact statement. My siblings and I have all suffered immensely, not just from losing our father, but also from losing a mother. The loss of our former lives. Her composed bravery in court was a powerful condemnation of her mother's actions. After a week of testimony, the case went to the jury. They reached a verdict after just 2 hours of deliberation. As the court clerk announced, we, the jury, unanimously find this defendant guilty. Emotions surged through the courtroom. Savannah, who'd attended every session of the trial, wept openly, embracing the supporters who'd stood by her through this harrowing ordeal. At sentencing, statements from both Savannah and her older brother Zachary were presented to the court. 5 lives completely destroyed, Zachary's statement read. She showed no remorse. I request the maximum sentence. She took my father's life, and I want justice. An eye for an eye. Judge Dennis Hemmon, agreeing with the prosecution that the crime was atrocious, sentenced Megan Jackson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The child abuse charges were eventually dropped after prosecutors explained they wanted to spare the children additional trauma from testifying, since their mother was already facing a lifetime behind bars. Weeks later, Chris Dontel faced his own sentencing. Despite his cooperation and his wife's plea for mercy, the judge imposed a maximum sentence for his role in the crime, 15 years for accessory after the fact to murder, and 5 years for conspiracy, to be served consecutively. To simply say, "I'm sorry," feels inadequate, Dontel said remorsefully at his sentencing, hollow words for the lives he helped destroy. From prison, Megan Jackson continues to proclaim her innocence, appealing her conviction and alleging in a letter that Dontel lied. But for Greg Rice's children, the verdict offered bittersweet and incomplete closure. Their lives were forever changed, their childhood stolen. Yet amid the grief, a spark of hope remains. There was a time living in that house when I thought there was no way out, Savannah Rice later revealed, her voice filled with resilience forged through adversity. No matter how difficult or terrible your situation may be, you can always overcome it and turn your life into what you want it to be. This stands as testament to the human spirit's unbreakable strength, a light that not even the darkest crimes could extinguish. Story 7. On June 3rd, 2024, the afternoon in North Olmsted, Ohio, a Cleveland suburb began under modest skies, where life's rhythm was usually steady and predictable. For Margot Wood, it was an ordinary day, much like countless others she'd shared with her 3-year-old son, Julian. He was her middle child, a happy, smiling boy who found joy in simple pleasures, like picking out flowers with his mother at the grocery store. That day, Margot had planned to go shopping with her mother, Julian, and her younger daughter. But the baby had fallen asleep, so only she and Julian went together. It was a small, everyday decision, the kind made thousands of times without a second thought. Yet it would forever alter the course of their lives. Inside the sprawling Giant Eagle supermarket on Loran Road, fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune. Julian, seated in the shopping cart, helped his mother select flowers, his laughter echoing through the aisles. Margot noticed nothing unusual, no sign that this routine errand would be their last together. She was a mother lost in the joyful world of her child, unaware of the storm brewing nearby. That storm had a name: Bianca Ellis. At 34, Ellis was adrift. Her life was a turbulent sea of mental anguish. Diagnosed with schizophrenia in childhood, her existence was an ongoing battle, a war waged both inside her mind and on the streets she often wandered. Her mother would later say that Bianca was like two different people, her personality shifting drastically depending on whether she was taking her medication. For the 6 to 8 months leading up to that fateful June day, she'd been without it, lost in a private world, unreachable by her family. Her path had been erratic. A desperate search for help that took her from Ohio to California, then to Florida and back again. A wanderer tormented by voices within. Her life was a mosaic of fractured episodes, a theft charge at a Walmart, a brief stint in jail, and release just a month before crossing paths with the Wood family. On the very day of the attack, her erratic behavior was evident. She'd arrived at the North Olmsted police station in a wheelchair with a suitcase, inquiring about her belongings. Told they weren't there, she became irritated, rolled her eyes, and in an odd act of defiance, turned off the lobby light as she left, abandoning both the wheelchair and suitcase. From the police station, Ellis proceeded to a Volunteers of America thrift store, a place of second chances and discarded items. But she wasn't looking for clothes or furniture. Security footage would later show her spending several minutes sorting through knives, her focus fixed and unsettling. She selected 2, testing their flexibility by tapping them against concrete pillars outside before leaving without paying. She then walked next door to a Things Remembered outlet store, dropping 1 knife as she tested them against a pillar. With 1 knife remaining, a formidable 12-inch butcher knife, she headed toward the Giant Eagle. Inside the supermarket, Ellis's path converged with Margot and Julian's. As they shopped, Ellis watched them, a silent hunter observing her prey. When Margot finished checking out and pushed the cart with her son toward the exit, Ellis turned and followed. She trailed them out of the store into the parking lot. Her footsteps were a quiet, menacing rhythm that Margot, busy with her groceries and child, failed to detect. The trunk of Margot's car was open, ready for the purchases from their everyday outing. As she turned, normalcy shattered. Bianca Ellis was there, advancing, knife in hand. In that heart-stopping moment, maternal instincts surged. Margot tried to push Julian back, to shield him with her own body. The first knife strike hit the car's trunk. Frantically, Margot tipped over the shopping cart, a desperate, primal attempt to create a barrier. But Ellis was relentless. She lunged at them, her movements swift and savage. She stabbed Julian in his cheek. Then, as his mother attempted to pull him from the cart, Ellis stabbed him again, this time in his back. Julian screamed after the second wound. Margot grabbed him from the cart, her hands covered in his blood. "Are you okay?" she cried out, a question whose terrible answer she already knew. Blood poured from her son's mouth. In the chaos, Ellis's blade also struck Margot, wounding her shoulder. The parking lot, moments earlier an ordinary scene of shoppers and vehicles, erupted into pandemonium. Screams cut through the afternoon air. A witness, Travis Bush, a DoorDash driver finishing his last delivery, had seen everything. He'd noticed Margot and her smiling son, then the woman dressed all in black walking just steps behind them. He saw Ellis raise her arm, the long knife blade glinting, followed by repeated brutal strikes. As Ellis walked away at a brisk pace, not quite running, Bush followed and confronted her, asking if she realized she just stabbed a child. Ellis responded with an eerie shrug and a silently mouthed word. Other bystanders, like Matthew Stroud, who was returning his shopping cart, also witnessed the attack and followed Ellis, telling his wife to call 911. He described her manner as she left as casual, like someone strolling through a park. casually swinging the blood-stained knife. Another witness, Griffin Schaff, an employee on break from Giant Eagle, noted that Ellis appeared to be smiling. Sergeant Luke Petrie was the first police officer to arrive at the scene, where he encountered a landscape of complete devastation. Cheryl Malinsky, a nurse who'd been shopping, was administering CPR to Julian, whose airway was blocked with blood. She detected no pulse. Rachel Craven, another nurse arriving in the parking lot, rushed to help with chest compressions, but their efforts were futile. Julian's wounds were devastating. A 4-inch deep stab wound to his face had cut through his tongue and severed his carotid artery, while another 4-inch wound to his back had pierced his lung. He was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced deceased. Margot received treatment for her stab wound, which would leave a permanent scar, an everlasting physical reminder of the day her life shattered. Police found Bianca Ellis walking in the direction of Dover Center Road, still holding the knife. When Officer Oliver Wilcox approached with his weapon drawn, she dropped the knife without resistance and obeyed his commands to lie on the ground. Her arrest proceeded without incident. The investigation that followed painted a grim picture of the crime. The murder weapon, a gray knife with a black handle and a Volunteers of America sticker, was recovered from a rocky area by the curb, soaked in blood. DNA testing confirmed Julian's blood on both the blade and Ellis's sweatshirt. Security footage from the thrift shop, outlet store, and supermarket methodically documented her actions, from selecting the knives to stalking her victims into the parking lot. Legal proceedings began but were immediately complicated by Ellis's mental state. Her behavior in court was bizarre and disturbing. She smiled and laughed during her arraignment, at one point responding to the judge in Spanish. She remained distant and uncooperative, preventing her attorneys from effectively communicating with her. In September 2024, a judge ruled she was incompetent to stand trial and ordered mental health treatment. Ellis received therapy for 5 months. Given antipsychotic medications, by February 2025, she'd made significant improvement. She was deemed competent to stand trial, and the case moved forward. Her defense team entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that her extensive history of mental illness, erratic behavior before the attack, and her conduct during and after the incident showed she lacked legal responsibility for her actions. The trial began on October 6, 2025. The prosecution, led by Anna Faraglia, presented arguments depicting Ellis as a calculating and purposeful killer. They asserted that while she might have a mental disorder, she understood her actions were wrong. They cited surveillance footage showing her taking 50 seconds to carefully select a knife and stalking her victims as evidence of an organized rather than disorganized mindset. The prosecution argued that rage, not delusion, drove her actions. The defense, led by Fernando Mack, didn't dispute the facts of the case. They admitted Ellis killed Julian Wood and attacked his mother. Their argument hinged entirely on the insanity defense. They called forensic psychiatrist Dr. Sarah West, who'd conducted Ellis's initial evaluation in July 2024, and found her severely mentally ill and incompetent for trial. Dr. West testified that Ellis had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had a long history of hospitalizations, delusions, and hallucinations. Ellis told Dr. West that she'd blacked out during the attack, and that voices told her to kill someone herself. Dr. West concluded that Ellis didn't know her actions were wrong at the time, and that they resulted from mental health symptoms rather than rational thinking. However, the prosecution offered their own expert witness, Dr. Stephen Knopfsinger, a forensic psychiatrist who interviewed Ellis after she regained competency. Dr. Knopfsinger agreed that Ellis had schizophrenia, but believed she didn't meet the legal standard for insanity. He testified that in his recorded interview, Ellis acknowledged it's wrong to stab people. She described losing control and being in a survival situation, but also said she acted out of anger and blacked out. Dr. Knopfsinger pointed to inconsistencies between Ellis's accounts and video evidence, concluding that rage, not insanity, drove the attack. The jury was presented with two competing portraits of Bianca Ellis, one of a woman consumed by a severe psychotic break, incapable of understanding the nature of her actions, another of a woman who acted with deliberate cruelty and anger despite her mental illness. On October 15th, 2025, after more than 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Bianca Ellis was found guilty on all counts. These included aggravated murder, 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, child endangerment, and petty theft. Once the verdict was read, Julian's mother and father, Margot and Jared Wood, spoke to reporters. "We just want to say thank you for all the love and support for our son," Margot said, her voice heavy with grief. "Everyone who's come to see him has shared kind words and support. We're incredibly grateful to all of you. Today's verdict was for him." Bianca Ellis's sentencing hearing was scheduled for October 27th, 2025. She faces life behind bars. The Bianca Ellis case represents a story of unimaginable tragedy for a family torn apart by unprovoked violence. It also raises profound and difficult questions about how mental illness intersects with the justice system. These are questions without easy answers. In the end, what remains is the heartbreaking memory of a 3-year-old boy whose life was taken in a supermarket parking lot on an ordinary day, and the lasting pain of a family forced to live with a reality forever changed by a moment of incomprehensible terror. Story 8. The fading spring sun, a gentle presence in the vast Georgia skies, cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Westminster Circle. This was a street of quiet contentment, of freshly mowed grass, and the soft hum of air conditioners fighting the approaching summer heat. The joyful shouts of children, a bright and carefree sound, occasionally drifted from backyards where sprinklers traced sparkling arcs through the air. It was a place where no real harm was ever expected, an enclave of suburban peace in the heart of Spalding County. But on May 12th, 2023, that enclave shattered. A small figure, strikingly thin and dressed in clothes that seemed to swallow his frail frame, emerged from the shadows. He was barefoot, his small feet padding silently on the warm pavement as he moved with a furtive, hunted manner. He was 10 years old, yet he carried the weight of a lifetime of suffering in his wide, fearful eyes. He was looking for food, a desperate, instinctive need that had finally driven him from the darkness that had become his reality. Unknown to him at that moment, his brave, desperate steps would expose a story of unimaginable cruelty. A story that would shock the nation and reveal the dark underbelly of a seemingly perfect family. This is the story of Kristen and Tyler Schindley, a couple who promised a loving home to a group of vulnerable children, but instead created a house of horrors that would leave one boy near death, and a community grappling with the disturbing realization that evil can exist anywhere, even on a quiet street in a peaceful town. Kristen and Tyler Schindley were, by all outward appearances, an exemplary couple. They were active in their church, a faith community that prided itself on compassion and kindness. They seemed to have everything: a comfortable home, a loving relationship, and a deep desire to make a difference. So when they decided to become foster parents, it seemed like a natural extension of their generous and caring nature. They were recruited by Families First for Children, a faith-based foster care agency working with the state to find homes for children in need. On paper, the Schindleys were ideal candidates. They passed all background checks, provided excellent references, and seemed eager to welcome children who'd faced difficult circumstances into their hearts and home. So that they were introduced to 5 siblings, a package deal that the state was anxious to keep together. There were 2 sets of twins, all younger than the 10-year-old boy who served as their older brother. The boy, whose identity was protected for privacy, was a quiet, observant child who'd already endured more than his share of pain. He desperately needed a safe, loving home environment where he could finally feel secure and valued. At first, it seemed he'd found it. The Schindleys presented themselves as devoted, attentive caregivers. They showered the children with affection, bought them new clothes and toys, and seemed committed to creating a happy, healthy family unit. But even in those early days, there were whispers of unease, subtle jarring notes in the otherwise perfect symphony of their new life. Sofia Gutierrez, a school counselor at Rock Spring Elementary School, was among the first to notice something was wrong. The boy would arrive at school with meager lunches, mere scraps of food barely enough to sustain a growing child. He was forbidden from eating the school-provided lunch, a rule that seemed both cruel and baffling. Gutierrez, a woman with a keen eye for the subtle signs of neglect, grew increasingly worried. She wasn't alone in her concern. The foster care agency that had originally recruited the Schindleys also began harboring doubts. The boy, in quiet, hesitant confessions, admitted he felt unsafe in his new home. The concerns were serious enough that Families First for Children made a bold and unusual decision. They revoked the Schindleys' foster care license and recommended to the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services that the adoption process be stopped. But the state, facing a shortage of foster families willing to take multiple siblings, found itself in a difficult position. The desire to keep the children together, a noble and well-intentioned goal, may have clouded their judgment. Despite serious warnings from both the school counselor and the foster care agency, the state made the fateful decision to override their concerns and approve the adoption, officially granting the Schindleys parental rights over all 5 siblings. It was a decision that would haunt everyone involved. The adoption was finalized, and the 5 children, who should have been protected, were now legally at the mercy of 2 people who would soon reveal themselves to be monsters. For the 10-year-old boy, the adoption marked the beginning of a descent into hell. What had started as subtle mistreatment quickly escalated into systematic torture. The Schindleys began to single him out, separating him from his siblings both physically and emotionally. He became, in their twisted worldview, the problem child, the one who didn't belong, the one who deserved punishment for simply existing. The abuse began with isolation. While his siblings were allowed to play, to laugh, to be children, he was locked away. His room, once a haven of childhood, was stripped bare. The only furnishings were a mattress without bedding on the floor, a puppy pad serving as a toilet, and a single window that was painted over and nailed shut, a cruel mockery of the outside world. The door was locked from the outside, confining him in a dark, silent existence. His bathroom was a testament to the Schindleys' cruelty. The light had been removed, plunging the space into perpetual darkness. There was no toilet paper, no towels, no shower curtain. The hot water had been shut off, forcing him to wash in freezing water. The only item present was a small Batman cup, a sad and lonely reminder of a childhood that was being systematically destroyed. Food, the most basic human need, was turned into a weapon of torment. While the rest of the household ate together, he was forced to eat his meals outside, alone. He was given rotten onions and avocados, leftovers barely fit for consumption. His hunger was so intense that he would eat whatever he could find, a wild, instinctive desperation that the Schindleys seemed to enjoy manipulating. In one especially vicious episode, they threw a hot dog into the swimming pool and watched as he, a poor swimmer, struggled to stay afloat, driven by his frantic need to reach the single piece of food. The family members, even his own siblings, stood by the pool laughing. The abuse wasn't just physical. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of his spirit, a calculated attempt to destroy his very being. On a family photo display in the Schindleys' bedroom, pictures of all the other children faced forward, a happy, smiling collection portraying a perfect family. His picture, however, was turned backward, a silent, eerie confirmation that he was the rejected child, the one they regretted adopting. His siblings, younger and more impressionable, didn't just witness the abuse. They were encouraged to participate. The Schindleys fostered an atmosphere of cruelty within their home, teaching the other children that their older brother was worthless and that his suffering was entertainment. They were being conditioned to take part in the abuse themselves, a disturbing cycle of their parents' violence. The neighbors living just yards away remained completely unaware of the atrocities happening inside the house on Westminster Circle. They saw the other children playing outside and heard their happy sounds, assuming everything was normal. They had no idea another child existed inside, a boy who was slowly being starved to death. A boy whose life had been so thoroughly erased that it was as though he'd never existed at all. For 3 long years, this boy endured an unbearable nightmare. He suffered hunger, beatings, and psychological torment. He existed as a ghost in his own home, imprisoned in a house of horrors. But even in the deepest darkness, the human spirit can be a powerful force. And on May 12, 2023, summoning a strength he didn't know he had, this boy decided to escape. He'd been left home alone, a rare and precious opportunity. He approached a privacy fence in the backyard where, by some stroke of luck, another child had left it slightly unsecured. He climbed, his frail, malnourished body trembling with both fear and determination, and managed to unlatch it from the other side. Freedom was his. He walked barefoot down Westminster Circle, a lone small figure against an idyllic suburban day. He was looking for food, for help, for anyone who would listen to his story. A neighbor found him, a woman so horrified by his condition that she immediately called law enforcement. When officers arrived, they encountered a child who was barely a shell of what he should have been. He was 10 years old, but weighed only 36 pounds, comparable to a much younger child. Dressed in toddler-sized clothing that hung on his skeletal frame, he bore the marks of starvation and intense fear. But above all, he felt utter desperation. "Please don't send me back," he begged officers in a weak, trembling voice. "I don't want to go back." He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors were shocked by his condition. He suffered from severe malnutrition and bradycardia, a dangerously slow heart rate. Dental damage and deformities had gone untreated. He was on the brink of death, subjected to cruelty almost beyond comprehension. But he survived. He'd broken free, and his ordeal would soon be exposed. The boy's escape set in motion events that would finally hold the Schindleys accountable. Police, armed with a search warrant, entered the home on Westminster Circle and faced stark evidence of his existence. They found locked rooms, bare mattresses painted over windows. They found bathrooms without heat, light, or basic hygiene supplies. They saw the family photos with one picture turned backward. As one prosecutor would later describe it, this was ground zero for all the evil in that house. The evidence was overwhelming. Kristen and Tyler Schindley were arrested and charged with a series of crimes, including attempted murder, child cruelty, false imprisonment, and aggravated battery. The remaining 4 children were placed in the custody of the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services, their futures forever altered by the trauma they'd witnessed and been part of. Neighbors were stunned. The Schindleys, who'd seemed like the perfect couple from the neighborhood church, were revealed as monsters. Those living nearby, who'd once waved to them in passing, now struggled to reconcile the image of the friendly, devout couple with the horrific reality coming to light. How could they have missed it? How could they have been so blind? But the truth was that the Schindleys had been masters of deception. They'd built a carefully crafted facade of normalcy, a false picture of a happy family that hid a dark, disturbing truth. They'd isolated the boy, erased his existence, and created an environment where his suffering went unnoticed by everyone else. The legal proceedings against Kristen and Tyler Schindley began in April 2025. And from the first day, the atmosphere in the courtroom was one of horror and disbelief. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Marie Broder and Assistant District Attorney Catherine Leonard, presented a case of unspeakable brutality. They called a succession of witnesses who painted a damning picture of the Schindleys' abuse. First responders testified about the boy's emaciated state and his desperate plea for help. A paramedic recalled the undersized clothing he wore and the terror visible in his eyes. A forensic expert showed the jury photographs of the horrifying home, the locked room, the barren bathroom, the painted-over window. Sofia Gutierrez, the school counselor who tried to stop the adoption, testified and shared her concerns with the court, her voice heavy with emotion. She'd seen the warning signs and tried to sound the alarm, but her warnings were ignored. Colleen Carter, a social worker for Families First, stated that their agency had also opposed the adoption, knowing the Schindleys were unfit as guardians. The defense team, faced with a mountain of evidence, argued that the Schindleys were simply overwhelmed. They claimed that the boy had behavioral problems and a food obsession, and that they'd tried to get help for him but couldn't find a doctor who could diagnose his condition. They portrayed Kristen and Tyler as caring parents who'd been pushed to their limits by the stress of raising 8 children during the COVID-19 pandemic. But neither the jury nor the public bought this explanation. The signs of deliberate, systematic abuse were too clear and too terrible to attribute to stress or a difficult child. Then, suddenly, just one day into the trial, Kristen and Tyler Schindley decided to plead guilty to all charges. It was a stunning admission of guilt, an implicit acknowledgement that their actions were indefensible. The sentencing hearing was a somber affair. Kristen and Tyler stood before the judge, wearing expressions of hollow remorse as they asked for mercy. "I want to say I'm sorry to all our children," Kristen said in an empty tone that echoed through the silent chamber. "My only desire is to raise children with love. Sometimes things get out of hand." But Judge Ben Coker wasn't buying the excuses. He'd reviewed all the evidence. He'd seen all the photographs. He was filled with righteous anger. "My hands are tied by constitutional law," he told them sternly. "You should be grateful for that restraint. Otherwise, I would deliver a punishment similar to what you inflicted." He sentenced both Kristen and Tyler Schindley to 40 years in prison, followed by 20 years of supervised release. A sentence reflecting the severity of their crimes, while ensuring they could never hurt another child again. The case of Kristen and Tyler Schindley is a story of extreme cruelty, one offering a disturbing lesson about evil hiding behind cheerful exteriors. But it's equally a story of remarkable resilience, about one small boy who defied all odds by finding the courage to escape his abusers and reclaim his life. His journey toward recovery will be long and difficult, but he's no longer invisible. He's a survivor, and his story, which began with one determined walk down a quiet suburban street, will stand as powerful testimony to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Story 9. The year 1992 brought a winter to Masterton, New Zealand, marked by a deep, penetrating cold. This was a town situated in the heart of the Wairarapa region, known for its rolling farmlands and a slow, steady pace of life. Along Judges Road, a quiet residential street, homes were sealed against the frigid air, their windows glowing with the warm, ordinary light of domesticity. But inside one such home, a cold far more intense than the seasonal chill was taking hold. It was the coldness of love turned sour, of a family unraveling at its seams, and of one man's wounded pride transforming into murderous rage. At 25 years old, Raymond Wahiu Ratima was adrift in the wreckage of his life. He and his wife, Tony, were trapped in the slow, painful dissolution of their marriage. The love and hope that had once bound them had worn thin, exposing only the raw, exposed nerves of resentment and blame. Their arguments had become a constant, corrosive drip that ate away at the very foundation of their family. for the sake of their 3 young boys, Piripi, 7, Barney, 5, and Stacy, 2. They'd moved in with Tony's parents, Philip and Christine. It was a last desperate attempt to find some stability amid the chaos, but this move only heightened the tension. The home on Judges Road, meant to be a sanctuary, had become a pressure cooker. Raymond, a man with a fragile ego and an ingrained need for dominance, felt his power slipping away. He was no longer the master of his domain, but a guest in someone else's house. His actions were scrutinized, his failures exposed for all to see. His relationship with Tony continued to deteriorate, and his frustration simmered, a dangerous building heat. The breaking point came through a physical altercation. The details have faded with time and the biased memories of a killer, but the outcome was clear. Philip and Christine, witnessing the escalating danger, told Raymond to leave. He was banished, cut off from his wife, and, most critically in his mind, from his children. For someone who psychiatrists would later describe as having a narcissistic sense of entitlement to control his wife's and children's lives, this wasn't just rejection. It was an amputation, a deep and intolerable wound to his ego. He felt spurned. His possessive tendencies and jealousy now burned unchecked like wildfire. He saw Tony's decision to separate from him and her family's support of that decision as the ultimate betrayal. He couldn't accept a life where he didn't possess his family. He couldn't tolerate a future where his sons would grow up without him, or where Tony might find happiness with someone else. In the twisted logic of his mind, a terrible solution began to form. If he couldn't have them alive with him, then no one else would either. He became convinced that sending them to a better place was the only way to protect his children from the pain of a broken home. It was an eerie, self-serving delusion, a way to reframe an act of supreme selfishness as one of twisted love. On the night of June 26, 1992, Raymond Ratima's mind, poisoned by a mixture of rage, shame, and distorted paternal devotion, made his way back to Judges Road. He didn't come seeking reconciliation or to plead for forgiveness. He came to reclaim what he considered his, to reunite them with him forever in what he now saw as the only possible way. Through death. Dwight Street lay unaware, ignorant that someone moved through the shadows carrying plans for an atrocity so terrible it would permanently scar the spirit of their tight-knit community and that of the entire country. The home on Judges Road was a haven where everyone slept. Inside rested 7 people bound by family ties, vulnerable in the silent darkness. Philip and Christine, heads of the family, were present, along with 2 of Tony's brothers, who also lived there. Then there were Raymond Ratima's 3 boys, Piripi, Barney, and Stacy, lost in the innocent sleep of childhood dreams. Also present was the pregnant girlfriend of one of Tony's brothers, carrying an unborn member of the family, a life yet to come. Tony herself was absent that night. Her absence would save her life, but leave her burdened with endless sorrow. Raymond Ratima entered like a phantom, overtaken by his ghastly mission. He moved through the hushed chambers, his heart a frozen lump of determination. He was no longer a partner or parent. Now he was merely a killer. The weapon he selected was brutally simple, a softball bat. He proceeded from room to room, from bed to bed, unleashing a brutal, systematic violence. He attacked his family members to death. The carnage was beyond comprehension. He began with the adults, those he held responsible for his banishment and the barriers to his control. Philip and Christine, the mother and father who'd sought to protect their daughter, were among the first to fall. He then moved on to their sons, who were also his brothers-in-law. Then he turned on the children, his own offspring, Piripi, aged 7, who was just beginning to understand the world around him, Barney, 5, full of energy and joy, and Stacy, just 2 years old, a toddler who knew only pure, unconditional love for his father. He ended all their lives. The violence extended beyond that. He also took the life of his brother-in-law's pregnant partner, extinguishing 2 lives in one horrific act. It was a massacre, a complete and total annihilation of a family line. But one person survived, not through mercy, but through luck. Another of Tony's brothers, who'd been inside the home as well, was attacked but managed to escape. He fled into the night, a sole survivor, a wounded and terrified witness to an infernal nightmare. Once the frenzy ended, Raymond Ratima, his rage finally spent, left the death-filled house and drove to the Masterton police station. There, he confessed to his actions, his account a blunt, emotionless summary of the horror he'd inflicted. The peaceful town of Masterton woke the next day to news that defied belief. 7 people, including 3 young children and an unborn baby, had been killed. An entire family had been wiped from existence, and the perpetrator was one of their own. The legal proceedings that followed were largely a formality, a grim conclusion to a story that had already reached its terrible end. Raymond Ratima pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder for the brother who escaped, and 1 count of causing the death of an unborn child. His defense team raised an insanity plea, but the psychiatric evaluations ordered by the court painted a different picture. Professor Philip Brind, then head of the region's forensic psychiatric service, determined that Ratima didn't suffer from mental illness, as defined by law Dawding. His actions weren't born from a mind detached from reality, but were instead the catastrophic result of a severely flawed character. Brian's assessment highlighted a combination of personality traits, limited intellectual capacity, deep feelings of rejection, underdeveloped social skills, and crucially, a narcissistic sense of entitlement to control his wife's and children's lives. Ratima's self-centered traits, his inability to accept rejection, his lack of empathy, and his intense jealousy combined with severe family stress to create a perfect storm of murderous rage. In September 1992, just 3 months after the massacre, Raymond Wahyu Ratima received a life imprisonment sentence with a non-parole period of 26 years. At the time, it was the longest minimum non-parole period ever imposed in New Zealand's legal history, a punishment that reflected the unprecedented horror of his crimes. He was imprisoned to serve his term, leaving behind a shattered community and a family irreparably devastated. For Tony Ratima, the sole survivor of her immediate family, the verdict marked the beginning of a life overshadowed by inconceivable grief. The person who'd vowed to love and protect her had become the source of her deepest pain, the killer of her children, the destroyer of her world. Over the next 30 years, Raymond Ratima existed as a ghost within New Zealand's prison system. He moved through the regulated, sterile environment of incarceration, a man forever marked by one night of unspeakable violence. Within the walls of Christchurch Men's Prison and Rimutaka Prison, he held jobs, aged, and participated in the slow, systematic path toward rehabilitation. Between 2013 and 2016, he attended 96 sessions with a psychologist. He received positive reviews for his work on prison grounds. Prison authorities at one point determined he no longer required correctional programs. On paper, he represented a model inmate, someone who'd faced his inner demons and was ready to re-enter society. Yet, the extremity of his crime, so far beyond normal human behavior, rendered conventional risk assessment tools seemingly inadequate. Psychological evaluations might suggest a low likelihood of reoffending, but as parole officials later noted, the severity and context of his crimes placed them well beyond any genuine capacity for such instruments to accurately measure his danger. How do you quantify the threat posed by someone who's already done the unthinkable? How can trust be placed in a person who's killed their own children? These were the questions facing New Zealand's parole board whenever Raymond Ratima's case came before them. He first became eligible for parole in 2002. And since then, he's appeared before the board over 10 times, each session adding another chapter to the long, agonizing story of his crime. On every occasion, release was denied. The parole reviews became a public ritual, a repeated national moment forcing the country to remember the horrors of the Masterton massacre. The board, tasked with weighing rehabilitation prospects against the paramount priority of public safety, wrestled with fundamental, unresolvable questions about whether Raymond Ratima could ever truly pose no risk if released. Over time, Ratima's version of events shifted gradually, moving from denial to a carefully crafted acknowledgement. For a long time, he maintained that he hadn't intended to murder his family, attributing his actions to overwhelming rage. But in a later hearing, he reversed course and admitted that the deaths were intentional. He offered his rationale, a cold and self-serving justification, stating he'd wanted to protect his children from the pain of his failed marriage. We were not entirely convinced that Mr. Ratima had truly understood the circumstances that led him to take the lives of these family members, the board stated in one of its rulings, expressing clear doubt. Their concerns extended beyond his past to include what lay ahead. During one session, it emerged that Ratima had resumed a relationship with a vulnerable woman from his past. The board noted troubling parallels between this new involvement and the one that had culminated in such devastating violence. They pointed out that the pressures of everyday life had never been part of their relationship, questioning his ability to handle a real-world partnership after years of confinement. To us, Mr. Ratima seemed incapable of recognizing the troubling connections between his past and present circumstances, they stated. The hearings were often tense and confrontational. In one exchange, the parole board chair bluntly suggested that Ratima should abandon any pursuit of parole, given the extremity of his actions. He urged Ratima to consider the perspective of the victims' families, a viewpoint that Ratima, with his severe lack of empathy, seemed unable to grasp. In an interesting legal development, Ratima also challenged the parole board itself. In 2023, he took the board to the High Court, arguing that his hearings were compromised by an appearance of bias. This alleged bias stemmed from Professor Philip Bryant, the psychiatrist who'd written the critical assessments of Ratima's mental state in 1992. Bryant had later joined the parole board and sat on 7 of Ratima's parole reviews. Ratima's lawyer argued that Bryant's extensive prior involvement with the case created a conflict of interest. The High Court agreed, finding there was an appearance of bias, and ordering a new hearing with a reconstituted panel. It was a small victory for Ratima in a series of defeats, a legal technicality in a story defined by stark brutality. But it didn't change the outcome. At his most recent hearing in March 2024, parole was once again denied. He'll face the board again in the future, another chapter yet to be written in this ongoing saga. Today, Raymond Wahyu Ratima is approaching 60 years old, a man who's lived more than half his life behind bars. The years have barely diminished the horror of his crime. He remains one of New Zealand's most infamous murderers, a symbol of a particular kind of domestic violence. A man who chose to annihilate his family rather than relinquish control over them. The house on Judges Road no longer stands. It was demolished years ago in a physical attempt to remove a stain from the landscape. But the memory of what happened there persists, a ghost that continues to haunt the small town of Masterton, a sobering reminder that sometimes those who claim to love us most are capable of unspeakable cruelty. Story 10. The town of Butte, Montana, wears its history openly. It's a place carved from the richest hill on earth, a landscape scarred and shaped by a century of copper mining. The massive, ghostly head frames of abandoned mines tower like silent monuments beneath the vast, indifferent sky. Their skeletal structures stand as a persistent reminder of a past filled with both fortune and ruin. In the fall of 2019, the air carried the first sharp bite of a harsh winter, a familiar scent of pine and cold earth. But for Andrea Shannon Nickerson, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating haze of a life falling apart. At 30 years old, Audrea was adrift in the wreckage of her own making. Her existence had narrowed to the confines of a home that no longer felt like a refuge. A space where the love she once knew with her husband had turned bitter with resentment and blame. The life they'd built together was being dismantled, packed into boxes, a physical representation of their emotional separation. Audrea was preparing to leave, to make a desperate journey across the country from the rugged heart of Montana to the distant, forested state of Maine. She wasn't just relocating, she was fleeing. She was a mother of 2 young children. A little boy just old enough to start forming memories she desperately hoped he wouldn't retain. And an infant daughter, 5 months old, a tiny, perfect being whose future should have been as limitless and free as the Montana horizon. The baby was a fragile anchor in the chaos of Audrea's life. A reason for hope, a reason to keep going. But Audrea was caught in a current stronger than maternal love. She was in the grip of a substance that promised brief bursts of clarity and energy, but delivered only chaos and despair. Methamphetamine was the architect of her downfall. It had hollowed out her days and flooded her nights with a jittery, electric restlessness that denied her peaceful sleep. It warped her perception, amplifying her anxieties and sharpening her anger's edge. The drug was a cruel and demanding companion, and it was under its influence that the final catastrophic argument with her husband erupted. The details of that fight were blurry, a cacophony of shouting and slamming doors, the same worn cycle of blame and denial that had become the soundtrack to their failing marriage. But this time felt different. It felt final. Overwhelmed by a wave of drug-fueled rage and desperation, Audrea made a decision. She wouldn't wait for the planned, orderly departure. She would leave immediately. She gathered her children. Their small bodies were a mixture of soft warmth and confused surprise. The baby, bundled against the night's chill, was a silent weight in her arms. Her son, sleepy and bewildered, followed her out into the cold darkness. She buckled them into their car seats. The familiar clicks of the restraints a jarring contrast to the panicked, uneven pounding of her own heart. She took the driver's seat, the keys trembling in her hand, and pulled away from the curb, leaving the ruins of her life in the rearview mirror. She had no destination, only an urgent, overwhelming need to be somewhere else. The roads of Butte were quiet, the town settling into its midweek evening routine. Headlights cut through the blackness as Audrea drove the vehicle, a small metal box of anguish speeding through the night. The methamphetamine coursed through her veins, a false rush of energy, masking the profound exhaustion beneath. Her thoughts raced wildly, a chaotic slideshow of past mistakes and looming fears. She had no idea where to go. She had no family nearby to turn to, no friend who could understand the depth of her despair. Her aimless drive eventually led her to the downtown grid of streets surrounding the Butte Silver Ball Law Enforcement Center. The brick fortress housing the police department stood as an ironic landmark in her mental fog. Perhaps it was an unconscious cry for help, a desperate, unspoken plea for someone to intervene before she lost all control. Or perhaps, in her impaired state, it simply seemed like a safe place to stop, somewhere no harm could reach them. She pulled over at the corner of Alaska and Granite Streets, less than 1 block from the police station. She turned off the lights but kept the engine idling, its soft hum filling the heavy quiet inside the car. The world had condensed into the vehicle's interior. In the back seat sat her son, who'd finally surrendered to sleep. In the front seat, the baby was starting to fuss, tiny whimpers piercing through the haze surrounding Audrea's consciousness like reality's sharp pinpricks. She released the infant from her car seat, bringing her forward and cradling her close, attempting to provide comfort through body warmth. The hours blurred together. The initial methamphetamine rush faded, replaced by overwhelming physical exhaustion. Her eyelids grew heavy, her body crying out for the rest it had been denied for so long. She fought against sleep's pull, her head drooping and then snapping back up, her awareness a flickering, unreliable flame. She was a mother failing in her watch, her duty to her children clashing with the biochemical fatigue overtaking her. Eventually, in the deep, quiet hours of the night, she gave in. Her head dropped, her body slumped, and she fell into a deep, unnatural sleep. As she slept, her form, no longer held by conscious control, shifted. She leaned over, her weight bearing down on the tiny, fragile body of the 5-month-old baby cradled beside her. There was no struggle, no cry, only the silent, unnoticed shift of pressure. A mother's unconscious embrace became a deadly blanket. Outside, the engine continued its hum, a mechanical heartbeat in a vehicle that had become a tomb. The city of Butte slept on, unaware of the silent tragedy unfolding in a parked car just steps from its own center of justice. Dawn broke on September 25th, 2019, casting a crisp, bright light across the city. It was a routine day for the officers of the Butte Silver Bow Law Enforcement Department. The overnight shift was transitioning to the day team, a standard handoff involving paperwork, coffee, and quiet conversation. It was approximately 8:40 a.m. and when two officers, their names not officially recorded but their actions forever part of this story, noticed something wrong. A car parked on the nearby street had its engine still running. Condensation clouded the windows, obscuring what was inside. It was a minor irregularity, but in police work, such small anomalies often reveal larger problems. They approached the vehicle, their footsteps echoing on the quiet street. They peered through the window and saw a woman slumped over the steering wheel, apparently asleep. They knocked on the glass, sharp and persistent. "Ma'am! Police! Ma'am, are you okay?" There was no response. The woman didn't move. They tried the door handles. Locked. Tight. A flicker of concern swelled into a wave of professional dread. One officer moved to the passenger side to get a better view, and then he saw it. Through a clear section of glass, he could see that she wasn't just leaning forward. She was lying partially on top of something. Or someone. A baby. The word hung, unspoken, but understood. The situation transformed instantly from a simple welfare check to one fraught with terrible urgency. "There's a baby in there," one said tersely, his voice edged with tension. They could see the baby wasn't moving. Fear set in, cold and piercing, and procedure gave way to an instinctive drive to get into that vehicle immediately. They decided to break a window. An officer drew his baton and delivered one swift, hard blow that shattered the passenger side window into countless fragments of safety glass scattered inside. The cold dawn air rushed into the car as Audrea Nickerson woke abruptly from her stupor at the sound of breaking glass and raised voices. She was disoriented, her mind thick with fog. But the focus wasn't on her. Officers reached inside urgently, pushing her aside as they scrambled toward the infant. One officer lifted out the baby girl, who lay limp, showing no vital signs. Her skin pale with bluish tones, no heartbeat or breathing detectable. He automatically started CPR according to training protocols, laying her on the hood of the car and beginning rhythmic chest compressions, his large hands seeming awkward against such a small rib cage, breathing into her mouth, offering his own breath like a desperate prayer for a life already departed. His partner radioed a tense call for an ambulance, his words a stark official summary of the horror. Infant, not breathing, no pulse, CPR in progress. The scene became a vortex of controlled chaos. More officers arrived, followed by EMTs who took over the revival attempts, working on the infant with grim, focused determination. But it was futile. The tiny life had been extinguished hours earlier beneath the unwitting weight of the mother who was meant to protect her. Sheriff Ed Lester arrived at the scene, his face set in solemn duty. He saw his officers pale and shaken, grappling with the aftermath. "There's a bit of a shadow over the department today because of this incident," he would later tell the press, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Everyone is disheartened, particularly those officers who performed CPR. They're somewhat distressed that they were unable to save the child. It's understandable." Inside the vehicle, they discovered Audreya's other child, a year-old boy still asleep in the back seat, innocently oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded so near him. He was taken into the custody of Child and Family Services, another piece of fallout from the wreckage of his mother's life. Audreya Nickerson, now fully conscious and confronting a horror beyond imagination, was escorted to the station for questioning. The drug haze was beginning to lift, replaced by the piercing, unbearable glare of truth. Her baby was gone, and she was responsible. The detectives' questions were muffled, their words a distant, meaningless buzz. She was in shock. A mother whose worst nightmare had just become reality. Authorities had many unanswered questions. Why she'd been there, how long she'd stayed, what events had led to this moment. But for now, they faced a dead infant, a shaken team of first responders, and a mother whose life had just shattered beyond recognition. No charges were filed that day. The machinery of justice would need to wait for the cold, objective findings of forensic analysis. An autopsy was ordered, and a blood sample was taken from Audreya. The truth of what happened in that vehicle would be revealed not through an emotional confession, but through the detached, methodical language of a medical examiner's report. In the days that followed, Audreya Nickerson moved like a ghost, hovering on the edges of a life that no longer belonged to her. The investigation was ongoing, but without the definitive autopsy and toxicology results, officials lacked sufficient grounds to hold her. She was considered a person of interest, a central figure in a death investigation. But legally, she wasn't yet considered a criminal. Not yet. So in a decision that seems both puzzling and unexpectedly compassionate, she was allowed to leave. She continued with her plan to move to Maine, a journey spanning over 2,500 miles, now weighted with an unbearable burden of grief and guilt. The cross-country trip felt like a surreal odyssey. Each mile that separated her from the tragedy in Montana brought her closer to a future she couldn't envision. How could she start fresh when her past had ended so catastrophically? How could she escape the memory of her daughter's death when it was carved into her? A wound that would never heal. She settled in the small rural town of Strong, Maine, a place defined by thick forests and quiet living. It was as far from the stark, sprawling landscapes of Montana as one could get, both geographically and emotionally. Here, she was unknown, just another resident in a small town, but she couldn't escape her own conscience. The knowledge of her actions and the image of her daughter's still body were constant sources of torment. Meanwhile, back in Montana, the investigation moved forward at the careful, methodical pace of forensic science. The state medical examiner conducted the autopsy, and the finding was as sorrowful as it was clinical. The infant had died from asphyxiation due to suffocation. It wasn't from a medical abnormality or a sudden mysterious condition. She'd been smothered. At the same time, the toxicology lab analyzed Audreya's blood sample. The results confirmed what law enforcement had suspected from the beginning. Her system was saturated with methamphetamine. With these two critical pieces, the cause of death and the mother's impairment, the picture became complete. This wasn't just a heartbreaking accident. It was a crime. The Silver Bow County Attorney's Office determined that Audreya Nickerson's conduct constituted negligent homicide. Her drug use had rendered her incapable of caring for her children, and that negligence directly resulted in her daughter's death. In early December 2019, almost 3 months after that terrible dawn, an arrest warrant was issued for Audreya Shannon Nickerson on charges of felony negligent homicide. Her bail was set at $250,000, a sum reflecting the seriousness of the crime. She was now officially a fugitive from justice. Word spread from Montana to Maine. On Saturday, December 14th, police officers located Audreya at a residence in Strong, Igor. The arrest was peaceful and without incident. The news that had taken 3 months to cross the country had finally caught up with her. The past she tried to escape had reached out and pulled her back. She was taken into custody and held at the Franklin County Jail. Her new life in Maine ended as abruptly as it had begun. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was an accused felon facing extradition and legal proceedings that would force her to confront all the consequences of her actions. The legal process following Audrea Nickerson's arrest proved to be a slow, arduous passage through judicial formalities. She was extradited from Maine back to Montana, a return journey mirroring her frantic escape months earlier. Only this time not behind the wheel, but as a prisoner under escort, with no control over what lay ahead. The case moved through the system slowly. COVID-19 added complications, delaying court proceedings and shifting hearings into the detached, impersonal realm of virtual sessions. It was in this distant electronic forum, on a Thursday in March 2021, that the proceedings reached their conclusive turn. Audrea Nickerson, appearing by video from jail, withdrew her initial plea of not guilty. Her voice, faint and strained over the audio system, spoke one significant word: guilty. The plea change acknowledged what she'd known internally from the start. She was at fault. There were no more excuses, no more legal maneuvers. Only the bare, unvarnished truth remained. Under the influence of methamphetamine, and that impaired state, she'd fallen asleep and had accidentally suffocated her infant. This was an admission not just of a criminal act, but of a profound and tragic failure in her role as a mother. Sam Cox, the Butte Chief Deputy County Attorney, accepted the plea. With this acknowledgement of guilt, a trial became unnecessary. What remained was only the sentencing, the official declaration of the price Audrea Nickerson would pay for her daughter's death. A pre-sentencing investigation was ordered, a process where the court would examine Audrea's history, her substance abuse struggles, and the circumstances leading to this tragedy, all to determine an appropriate and just sentence. The guilty plea marked a point of legal closure. But for Audrea, it meant something deeper. It was a surrender to reality, to justice, and to the overwhelming weight of her guilt. By admitting responsibility, she was finally taking ownership of her actions, a first agonizing step on a long and uncertain path toward possible redemption. That journey concluded with a sentencing hearing in the summer of 2021. Audrea Nickerson, now physically present before the judge rather than an image on a screen, received a sentence of 14 years in the Montana Women's Prison. 14 years, a span of time that seemed both vast and strangely insufficient. It was punishment for her crime, but could never equal the permanent sentence of sorrow she'd already imposed on herself. The story of Audrea Shannon Nickerson is tragedy in its purest form, a narrative without villains, only victims. The most obvious victim was her 5-month-old daughter, an infant robbed of a life barely begun. But Audrea herself was a victim of her addiction, her circumstances, and ultimately of one catastrophic moment of human frailty. Her surviving son was another victim, destined to grow up without his mother or sister. The police who broke into that car and tried to revive an unresponsive baby were victims too, forever marked by the trauma of that dawn encounter. Story 11. The vast, empty expanses of the American West are keepers of secrets. They form a landscape of sagebrush and sky, of lonely roads stretching toward an endless horizon. For generations, people have come here seeking refuge, a place to disappear and start over. But the terrain is as unforgiving as it is beautiful, and sometimes the secrets it holds are not of fresh beginnings, but of tragic, solitary endings. In the summer of 2009, this ancient landscape would become the final silent witness to the closing chapter in the life of a young man from Kansas. A man who traveled 700 miles to escape from a mistake, only to run headlong into a permanent, and devastating resolution. This is the story of Michael Braden Fuxa, a tale not of a hardened criminal, but of a good young man who made a bad decision, and under the weight of that decision, simply vanished into the heart of America. In the carefully manicured suburbs of Olathe, Kansas, Braden Fuxa embodied all-American promise. At 22 years old, he was handsome and fit, a tanned, well-built young man with a perfect smile and the quiet confidence of someone who'd always played by the rules. He maintained a close relationship with his parents, Todd and Stara, who still cut his hair, and with whom he shared an easy, open rapport. He was an avid outdoorsman, a person who found peace in the whisper of leaves and the quiet solitude of fishing. It was this love for the outdoors that had led him to employment in the loss prevention department at the local base pro shop, a haven for hunting, fishing, and camping gear. To his friends and family, Braden's life seemed to be on a steady, predictable path. He had a roommate, a girlfriend, and the carefree freedom of a young adult finding his way. But beneath the calm surface of this suburban existence, an undercurrent of worry was beginning to overwhelm him. His work hours had been cut. He was struggling financially, a private shame he hid from his parents, whom he knew would help without hesitation. He'd fallen behind on rent payments in both June and July, a small but telling sign of a life slowly unraveling. The pressure built, a quiet internal vice, and at some point in early July, that pressure found an outlet in one catastrophic error in judgment. The details of the crime weren't the stuff of cinematic heists. There was no elaborate plan, no masked assault. It was a simple act, born of desperation. Braden, whose job was to prevent theft, became a thief himself. He was tasked with transferring money from the cash registers to a secure office. On July 6, 2009, he diverted funds from that day's receipts, taking over $1,000 for himself. It's a clumsy theft by an amateur's hand. He was caught almost immediately. Store management confronted him. Braden, the good kid who'd never been in serious trouble, suddenly found himself in unfamiliar territory. He cooperated with police officers and returned part of what he'd stolen. But once the wheels of justice begin turning, they cannot easily be stopped. On July 9th, he was arrested on felony theft charges, which led to him spending one frightening night at the New Century Adult Detention Center in Gardner. They took his mugshot, an image showing someone completely transformed. Gone was the tanned, smiling boy, replaced instead by a pale, wax-like figure with hollow lips and wide, disbelieving eyes, draped in a gray bib that stripped away identity. It was a portrait of someone who'd always stayed within boundaries, suddenly finding himself inexplicably behind locked doors. He was released the next day, pending a court hearing scheduled for July 16th. What nobody seemed to explain to him, what he evidently couldn't grasp amid his panic, was that the situation wasn't catastrophic. For a first-time offender with no previous record, the charge being a level 9 felony, the least severe category in Kansas, would likely have resulted in probation. The single overnight incarceration was probably the only jail time he'd ever face. Detective Kenton Thompson of the Olathe Police Department, the person who dedicated years to investigating this case, later reflected on the tragic misjudgment. Numerous alternatives existed excluding imprisonment or harsh penalties, he said. Whether he understood this is unclear. His perception suggests he possibly didn't. Perhaps he believed, this is it. I'm in really deep trouble over felony theft. Braden was indeed in deep trouble, though not legally. Rather, he was drowning in personal shame, unable to face his parents or endure the public embarrassment of a courtroom appearance. He'd built his identity around being a dutiful son, a dependable friend, a faithful worker. One rash move had shattered that image, and he saw no way to reassemble the pieces. So he chose to escape the consequences, to flee. A hastily conceived plan born from a frantic mind during the solitary hours consumed by alarm. But he masked it well. On the night of July 14th, he stayed with his girlfriend, sharing one last fleeting moment of normalcy. The following day, July 15th, he set his escape plan in motion. He told his roommate he was going to his parents' house in Olathe. Todd and Stara were away, a circumstance that gave him the opening he needed. Taking advantage of the empty house, he entered and made two critical decisions. He went to his parents' bedroom and took their 9mm Beretta pistol, then accessed their computer to transfer $800 from their bank account to his. A final secret withdrawal from the family coffers. Even as he prepared to sever all ties, he maintained a disturbingly normal facade. He casually texted his mother about his father's movie preferences, a small but piercing act of deception that would later haunt her. Afterward, he drove to a bank and withdrew the $800 in cash. By the morning of July 16th, the exact day he was supposed to appear in court, Braden Fuchsa had vanished. He was heading westward in his 1996 maroon Ford Explorer, a fugitive from a crime that loomed larger in his mind than in legal reality. No one knew where he was. He'd been missing for 4 days before his parents realized something was terribly wrong. The vast highway represents freedom, but for Braden Fuchsa, it was an escape into uncertainty. He covered 700 miles, Kansas flatlands giving way to Wyoming's rolling hills and endless sky. He was driving north on Interstate 25, a lonely strip of pavement, cutting through the heart of the cowboy state. On the morning of July 16th, his journey was briefly interrupted by a flat tire near the small town of Wheatland. He pulled off the interstate and found a nearby auto repair shop. Security footage at the station captured his image, a blurry final sighting of a fleeing young man. A tow truck operator changed the tire, and Braden purchased a used replacement. He quickly resumed his northward journey but didn't get far. Just an hour later, approximately 50 miles up the road, he steered his Ford Explorer onto the highway shoulder. He was near mile marker 122 in a remote stretch of interstate called Wolf Creek, north of Wheatland and near Douglas. It was here, on the edge of a desolate road beneath Wyoming's vast, uncaring sky, that Braden Fuchsa's trail ended. At midday, a Wyoming Highway Patrol officer spotted the abandoned vehicle and placed a sticker on it, standard procedure. He'd missed encountering Braden by only an hour and 15 minutes. Inside the car, it looked as though Braden had momentarily stepped out. The keys were under the floor mat. His laptop, a vital connection to his former life, was hidden under a pile of clothes in the back seat. The Explorer had 3/4 of a tank of gas and a freshly installed used tire. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no hint of foul play. It appeared, as Detective Thompson would later speculate, that he'd deliberately left the vehicle to be found. A final small kindness to the parents he was abandoning. After securing his car, Braden Fuchsa seems to have simply walked away on foot. His family believed he carried only a small blue Nike duffel bag, the hiking boots he wore, a pocket knife, and the 9mm Beretta he'd taken from his parents' home. He powered down his cell phone, severing his last digital connection to the world he was leaving behind, and disappeared into Wyoming's rugged landscape. It took 3 days for his parents to fully understand the severity of the situation. When Braden didn't show up in court and they couldn't reach him, their worry escalated into frantic fear. On July 19th, Todd and Stara Fuchsa reported him missing to the Olathe Police Department. The following Friday, they made the long, sorrowful drive to Douglas, Wyoming, to reclaim the car they'd bought for their son in high school. The journey felt like a pilgrimage into a nightmare. Each mile took them further from their familiar world, and deeper into a mystery that had swallowed their son. They searched the vehicle meticulously, hunting for clues or any sign of Braden's destination or fate. The disheveled clothing in the back suggested he'd hastily sorted through his belongings, deciding what was essential and what could be left behind. The receipt from Wheatland's auto shop provided a fragment of timeline, but one that ended abruptly beside a roadway. The search for Braden Fuxa had begun. For 6 years that followed, Todd and Stara Fuxa's existence revolved around one agonizing question. Where is Braden? They lived in suspended animation, caught between hope and grief. The search for their son became their life's dedication, and relentless, all-consuming quest for truth. They distributed missing person posters bearing Braden's handsome, smiling face throughout western states. A stark contrast to the troubled person in the mugshot. They worked closely with Detective Kenton Thompson, who adopted Braden's case as a personal mission. The thick binder on his desk, overflowing with leads, tips, and dead ends, stood as testament to the exhaustive effort dedicated to the search. The investigation was a frustrating journey through countless false trails. Could he be living off the grid, using his wilderness skills to survive in Wyoming's vast wilds? Was he hiding in plain sight, having adopted a new identity in some other town? Or had he met with harm on that lonely road? There were flickers of hope, moments that seemed to herald a breakthrough. In February 2010, Linda Curl, an employee at a Salvation Army Community Center in Cheyenne, called Detective Thompson. She was convinced she'd seen Braden. He'd come in for a free meal, she explained, and he stood out. He was far too clean and overly polite for their usual clientele, she remembered. He was in line with people whose clothes hadn't been washed in 6 months, she noted. She said he seemed inexperienced, new to homelessness. The lid was electrifying. It was followed by the discovery of a receipt from that same Salvation Army listing clothing given to someone who'd signed as Brad Fuxa. But the handwriting didn't seem to match Braden's, and the sighting, like so many others, eventually led nowhere. The Fuxas and a team of volunteers conducted a thorough search of the area where the vehicle was found. They combed the terrain looking for any sign of a camp, a shelter, or a grave. They found nothing. They reached out to wildlife officers, asking about any record of him being cited for illegal fishing or hunting. Again, nothing emerged. The silence was deafening. It was as though the earth had simply swallowed him whole. As time passed, the family's hope of finding Braden alive began to fade, replaced by a grim determination to at least recover him. Detective Thompson submitted Braden's dental records and DNA profile to national databases, a somber preparation for the possibility that his body might someday be discovered. For Todd and Stara, the lack of certainty was a unique form of torture. They were trapped in an endless state of grief, unable to mourn fully or move forward. Their son was a ghost, a presence only in their memories and on the countless posters displaying his picture. The resolution to the mystery, when it finally came, didn't stem from a detective's intuition or a fresh lead. It was chance, an unexpected encounter between two hikers in Wyoming's harsh landscape. On May 3rd, 2015, almost 6 years after Braden Fuxa disappeared, two people were hiking in the rough, isolated terrain near Wolf Creek, close to where the Ford Explorer had been abandoned. They were in a location far from common trails, a spot rarely visited by anyone, and there they discovered them. Sun-bleached skeletal remains scattered by weather and time. Near the remains lay a backpack and a 9mm Beretta pistol. The long, agonizing search for Braden Fuxa had ended. The Converse County Sheriff's Office was called to the scene. The recovery was a slow and sorrowful process. The firearm serial number provided the first critical evidence. It matched exactly. This was the weapon Braden had taken from his parents' home. Dental records provided the final undeniable confirmation. The remains were those of Michael Braden Fuxa. The manner of death was consistent with what his family and officials had long feared, but refused to accept. Suicide by self-inflicted gunshot wound, ruled by the coroner. The discovery brought a strange and sorrowful sense of closure. The era of uncertainty had ended at last. Todd and Stara Fuxa finally had an answer to the question that had haunted every waking moment. Their son had died, but was no longer missing. They could now lay him to rest properly. Braden Fuxa's story is one of immense tragedy. It isn't about someone hardened meeting violence. but rather about someone so consumed by shame over disappointing loved ones that he chose an irreversible way out. His retreat into Wyoming's wilderness wasn't toward renewal, but toward solitude leading to death itself. He left behind everything familiar, finding seclusion in nature's expanse, where ultimately despair drove him toward finality. One last act, alone. In the end, they accepted the truth. A sorrowful and solitary tale of a young man who got lost, not in the wild, but in the landscape of his own despair.